Before Abigail Harper's boots had even settled in the mud of Clearwater Crossing, a stranger spat at her feet and told the whole street that Jacob Calloway had ordered a wife and gotten a milk cow instead. The crowd roared with laughter. Abigail didn't cry, didn't run, didn't beg for mercy. She bent down, hoisted a fallen crate onto her hip like it weighed nothing, and carried it straight past the man who'd humiliated her, silencing the street with one act of quiet, unshakable defiance. She had 11 days of travel behind her, 90 days of ruin ahead of her, and no intention of being laughed off this land. If you believe a woman's worth is never measured by her size, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end. Drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I love seeing how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The stagecoach wheel struck a rut hard enough to throw Abigail Harper against the door, and before the driver had even called the horses to a full stop, she shoved it open herself and stepped down into the mud of Clearwater Crossing with her chin high and her jaw set like iron. A man near the feed store spat tobacco juice at her boots and said loud enough for the whole street to hear that Jacob Calloway had ordered a wife and gotten a milk cow instead. The crowd laughed. Abigail did not look away from him. She bent down, picked up the crate of nails he'd dropped in his hurry to point and jeer, hefted it onto her hip like it weighed nothing, and carried it straight past him to the mercantile counter before anyone could stop laughing long enough to be ashamed of themselves. "Somebody order this," she asked the clerk, setting it down without so much as a grunt. The clerk, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers, stared at her like she'd sprouted a second head. That's Mr. Pruitt's order, ma'am." "Then Mr. Pruitt ought to hire hands who can carry their own freight," Abigail said, and turned back toward the street where the laughter had gone quiet and uncertain the way laughter does when the thing it was aimed at refuses to bleed. She had traveled 11 days from Kansas on the promise of a letter 3 pages of careful handwriting from a rancher named Jacob Calloway, who said he needed a practical woman, not a delicate one, someone who could keep a house and not complain about the isolation. He had not asked for a beauty. He had been plain about that, plainer than most men who wrote to mail-order agencies, and Abigail had respected the honesty enough to answer him back with equal honesty of her own. She had told him she was not a small woman, that she had spent her girlhood working her father's failing farm in Kansas instead of embroidering samplers, that she knew cattle and drought and debt better than she knew fashion plates. He had written back one line. "That suits me fine, Miss Harper. Come when you're ready." Nobody in Clearwater Crossing looked like they thought it suited anybody fine. "Lord have mercy," an older woman muttered to her companion, not troubling to lower her voice. "Poor Jacob Calloway. Man already buried one wife. Now he's fixing to bury himself under that." Abigail's spine did not bend. She had heard worse in Kansas from her own kin, who'd told her plainly that no man would ever want a woman built the way she was built, that she'd best make her peace with spinsterhood and her father's kitchen. She had made no such peace. She had saved every dollar she could pinch from selling preserves at the county fair. She had answered Jacob Calloway's advertisement with her own 2 hands trembling only a little, and she was not about to let a street full of strangers shame her back onto that stagecoach. A man came around the corner of the livery at a hard walk, hat pulled low, coat dusted with trail dirt, and the crowd's attention swung toward him like iron filings to a magnet. He was tall, sun-browned, with the kind of tired lines around his eyes that came from carrying too much for too long. He stopped when he saw her. Abigail watched something in his face fall just for a moment, quick as a shadow crossing a field, gone almost before she could be certain she'd seen it at all. "Miss Harper," he said. His voice was rough, like it wasn't used much for anything but shouting at cattle. "Jacob Calloway. Mr. Calloway." She held out her hand, plain as a business deal, because that was exactly what this was. He looked at it a beat too long before he shook it, and his palm was hard and calloused, and his grip was careful, like he was afraid of breaking something, though she was fairly certain she could have hauled him out of a ditch without much trouble. "I reckon this is more folks than you expected to meet you," he said. "I reckon they expected someone else entirely," Abigail said. "I'm sorry to disappoint the whole town at once. Seems inefficient of me not to spread it out." That earned her nothing from him but a long look, unreadable, and then he bent to pick up her trunk before she could reach it herself. "I've got it," she said. "I don't doubt it," he said. "But I asked you here to keep house, not haul your own luggage down Main Street while I stand around with my hat in my hands." It was the closest thing to kindness anybody in that town had offered her since the stagecoach door opened, and Abigail found herself unsettled by how much it steadied her. The wagon ride out of town was quiet enough that Abigail could hear the wheels grinding over stone and the creak of the harness, and underneath all of it, the particular silence of a man working up to say something he didn't want to say. She let him take his time. She had learned patience the hard way, in a house where her opinion was rarely asked, and even less often wanted, and she was not about to spend her first hour with Jacob Calloway, filling silence, just to make him comfortable. "I ought to tell you plain," he said, finally, eyes on the road, "before we get to the place. I'm behind on near everything. Fences down in the north pasture, wells low. Bank's been sending letters I haven't opened in a month because I already know what they say." He glanced sideways at her quick, like he was bracing for her to ask the driver to turn the wagon around. "I wrote you because I need a wife who can run a house on nothing and not complain about it. That's the whole truth of it. I ain't got much else to offer." "You offered honesty," Abigail said. "That's worth more to me than a well-stocked pantry, Mr. Calloway. I've done without plenty. I know how to do without plenty." Most women say that till they see it. Most women didn't grow up watching their father lose 2 crops running to drought and a 3rd to hail, she said. "I'm not most women. You'll find that out quick enough, so I'd rather you hear it from me now than be surprised by it later." He didn't answer that, but she saw his jaw work, saw him turn it over like a stone. He was deciding whether to throw or to keep, and something in his shoulders eased a fraction, like a man setting down a sack he hadn't realized he was still carrying. The ranch came into view slow, the way bad news does, a little at a time, so a person can't quite point to the moment it became undeniable. Fence posts leaning like drunk men, a barn roof patched with tin that didn't match, cattle scattered thin across grass gone brown and short. The cabin itself sat low and gray, smoke-stained at the chimney, one window boarded over instead of glassed. Abigail took it all in without a word, cataloging it the way she'd cataloged her father's failing farm 100 times over. Not with despair, but with the cold, practical eye of someone already counting what could be fixed and what couldn't. "It ain't much," Jacob said, and there was something raw under the flatness of his voice, something that told her this admission cost him more than the one about the bank letters had. "It's a start," Abigail said. He looked at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. Inside the cabin was worse than the outside had promised. Dishes stacked unwashed. A woman's shawl still hanging on a peg by the door, faded and dusty, and Abigail understood without being told whose it had been and did not ask. The stove was cold. The floor hadn't seen a broom in longer than Jacob likely wanted to admit. She set her trunk down in the corner. He pointed to and began taking off her gloves, and she felt him watching her, waiting. Maybe for her to flinch, the way the last 3 women the agency had sent must have flinched before they climbed back onto stagecoaches and never rode again. "I'll want that stove going within the hour," she said. "And I'll need to know where you keep your ledgers." "My what?" "Your books, Mr. Calloway, your accounts. If I'm to run this house on nothing, I need to know exactly how much nothing I'm working with." "That ain't a housekeeper's business." "It's my business if I'm the one deciding whether we eat beans 3 nights running or 4, she said, and there was no heat in it, just plain fact, the way she'd have said the sky was blue. "I don't aim to make decisions blind, Mr. Calloway. I never have, and I'm too old to start now." He stared at her a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't yet name, not quite respect. Not yet, but the first crack in a wall that had been standing a long time. "Kitchen's through there," he said, finally jerking his chin toward the back. "Ledgers are in the trunk under the window. God help you if you can make sense of them. I sure as hell can't. By supper, beans and hard bread, because that was what the pantry held, and Abigail had no intention of pretending otherwise. She'd already found 4 separate errors in his bookkeeping. 2 of them costing him money. He didn't have to lose. She didn't say so at the table. She let him eat in peace, watching him from the corner of her eye, the way he ate like a man who'd forgotten meals were meant to be more than fuel, fast and joyless, staring somewhere past the wall. "You've got a debt to Whitfield's feed that's charging you interest you don't owe," she said, once his plate was empty. "I read the terms twice to be sure. He's billing you like it's a running account, but your original note says flat rate paid in full inside 90 days. You're 3 months past that, and he's tacking on charges the paper doesn't allow." Jacob set down his fork slow. "You read the whole ledger in an afternoon." "I read fast when I'm looking for someone cheating me," Abigail said. "Or cheating you in this case. Come morning, I'd like to ride into town and have a conversation with Mr. Whitfield, if you'll permit it." "Permit it." He said the words like they tasted strange in his mouth. "Miss Harper, you've been on this ranch 4 hours. 4 hours is enough time to see you're bleeding money out of a wound somebody else opened," she said. "I don't need a month to know rot when I smell it." He didn't answer for a long moment, and when he did, his voice had changed, gone quieter, rougher at the edges. "My first wife never once asked to see the ledgers, never wanted to know how bad it was. Reckon she thought not knowing kept it from being true. I'm not her," Abigail said, gentle now, because she understood grief when she heard it standing in a doorway, uninvited but present all the same. "I don't aim to replace her, Mr. Calloway. I aim to keep this ranch from going under because I expect that's closer to what you actually need than a woman who sweeps floors and asks no questions." He looked at her a long time in the lamplight, and for the first time since the stagecoach door had opened onto a street full of laughing strangers. Abigail Harper saw something in a man's face that wasn't pity and wasn't disappointment. It looked, if she dared name it so soon, almost like hope, thin and unpracticed, the kind that hadn't been let out of its cage in a long while, and didn't quite trust the open door. Morning came hard and early, the way it always did on a ranch running short-handed, and Abigail was up before Jacob's stove-lit coffee boiling the previous night's ledger pages, spread across the table with her own notes, scrawled in the margins. He came in, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and stopped dead at the sight of her, already dressed, already working, a woman who looked like she'd never once considered that mornings were for anything but starting. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept enough," she said, which wasn't quite true, but she'd learned long ago not to explain herself over small mercies. "I want you to look at this before we ride to town. Whitfield's charged you for feed deliveries in April and June, both, but your own notes here." She tapped a page. "Say you hauled the June order yourself from Miller's on account of Whitfield being short. He's billing you for feed he never gave you." Jacob leaned over the table, and she watched him read it twice, his mouth tightening with each pass. "Son of a—" He caught himself, glanced at her. "Beg your pardon?" "Don't beg it on my account," Abigail said. "I've said worse over smaller thefts." They rode into Clearwater Crossing together, and if the town had expected the mockery of the day before to repeat itself, Abigail gave them nothing to work with. She sat straight in the wagon seat ledger, tucked under her arm like a weapon she knew how to use. And when Otis Whitfield came out from behind his counter, with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, and a smile already halfway to condescending, she set the ledger down in front of him and did not smile back. "Mr. Whitfield, I have gone through Mr. Calloway's accounts, and I find you've billed him for a delivery in June that never left your yard. He hauled that feed himself from Miller's on account of your shortage. I expect you remember that, since Miller's clerk certainly does." Whitfield's smile thinned. "Now, ma'am, I don't know who's been telling you about my business. Nobody's told me anything, Mr. Whitfield. I read numbers. Numbers don't lie even when the men writing them do." She kept her voice level, pleasant, even the way she'd learned to speak to men who mistook a woman's calm for weakness, right up until it cost them. "You'll want to correct this account, and you'll want to do it today, because if you don't, I'll be taking these figures to the county assessor, and I expect he'll be curious how many other ranchers you've billed for feed that stayed in your own barn." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Jacob stood a half-step behind her arms, crossed, saying nothing, letting her fight a battle she'd claimed for her own, and Abigail felt something settle in her chest, that she hadn't felt since long before her father's farm went under the particular, unshakable satisfaction of being right and being heard in the same breath. Whitfield corrected the account. It took him 11 minutes and a great deal of muttering, but he corrected it, and by the time Abigail and Jacob rode back out of town, the same faces that had laughed at her the day before were watching from doorways with a different look entirely, something wary and uncertain. The look people give a thing they no longer understand well enough to mock. "You made an enemy," Jacob said once they were clear of the last building. "I made a debtor pay what he owed," Abigail said. "If that makes an enemy of him, he was never going to be a friend regardless." Jacob was quiet a while, the wagon wheels grinding over the dry road, and then he said low, like the words cost him something to hand over, "Nobody's ever stood up for this ranch like that. Not since my pa died. Not even my—" He stopped himself, and Abigail let him stop because some sentences a man has to finish in his own time, or not at all. "I didn't stand up for the ranch," she said. "I stood up for what's fair. The ranch just happened to be on the right side of it. Same thing way I see it." "Maybe," Abigail allowed. "But I'd rather you trust me because I'm right than because I'm yours. One of those lasts, the other doesn't." He looked at her sideways, something working behind his eyes. She couldn't yet read and didn't answer, but he didn't look away either, and for a woman who'd spent 28 years being looked past, that alone felt like the beginning of something she hadn't dared to want. The weeks that followed built themselves brick by brick, the way trust always does when it's built on something sturdier than sweet words. Abigail rose before dawn and worked past dark, not because Jacob demanded it, but because idle hands had never once solved a debt, and she had debts enough behind her to know the difference between resting and hiding. She walked every acre of that ranch on her own 2 feet, inside the first month boots caked with mud, notebook filling with observations no one had asked her to make. She found the spring in the northeast corner that had been capped off and forgotten, silted over by a decade of neglect. She found the fence line in the lower pasture that had been rebuilt wrong, funneling runoff straight through the best grazing instead of around it. She found buried in a drawer a stack of unopened letters from the bank, and she read every one of them at the kitchen table by lamplight while Jacob slept, because somebody in that house needed to know exactly how close to the edge they were standing, and she'd rather it be her than let him wake up one morning to find the ground already gone. 90 days, she told him the morning she finally laid the letters out for him to see. "That's what they're giving you before they call the note due in full. 90 days, Mr. Calloway, and near $400 we don't have." He sat down hard at the table, and for a long moment he didn't speak, just stared at the letters like they might rearrange themselves into better news if he looked long enough. "I knew it was bad," he said finally. "I didn't know it was that bad." "Now you do," Abigail said. "And now we can do something about it instead of pretending the mail doesn't exist." "We," he repeated like the word was unfamiliar in his mouth. "We," she said again, firm. "Unless you'd rather do it alone, in which case I'll pack my trunk and save us both the trouble of pretending otherwise." "No." The word came faster than he seemed to expect from himself, and he looked almost startled by his own urgency. "No, I don't want that." Something passed between them then, quiet and unspoken, and Abigail did not press it because she had learned that some truths needed room to grow before a person could say them out loud. And she suspected Jacob Calloway was a man who'd spent so long being alone that he'd forgotten how to ask for anything at all, let alone for company in his ruin. They worked the ranch together after that in a way that made the whole valley take notice, whether the valley liked it or not. Abigail rebuilt the fence line herself with a post hole digger and a stubbornness that left blisters on both her hands, refusing every offer of help from Jacob until she'd proved to herself she could do it. She uncapped the buried spring with a shovel and 3 days of aching back, and when the water finally broke free, clear and cold and abundant, she stood there with mud to her elbows and laughed out loud for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, and Jacob, riding up behind her, stopped his horse and just watched her laugh, like he'd never seen the sight before and didn't quite know what to do with it. "You found water," he said, like he still couldn't quite believe it. "I found what was already here," Abigail said. Your father dug this spring decades back. Somebody just let the valley bury it. That's most of what's wrong with this ranch, Mr. Calloway. Not that the land's poor. That good work got buried, and nobody thought to dig it back up." He dismounted. Slow walked to the edge of the spring, crouched down, and let the water run over his fingers, like he was greeting an old friend he'd thought was dead. "My pa started this," he said quietly. "Never got to finish it. Died before the trench was dug all the way through to the lower pasture." "Then we'll finish it," Abigail said. "Seems a shame to let a good man's work go to waste twice." He looked up at her, water dripping from his hand, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, and the silence between them had stopped being awkward somewhere in the last few weeks without either one quite noticing when. Not everyone in the valley took kindly to the change. Cyrus Beaumont, who ran the largest spread bordering Callaway land and had spent years hoping to buy Jacob out cheap once the ranch finally failed, rode over uninvited on a Sunday afternoon and found Abigail up on the barn roof herself, hammer in hand, replacing rotted shingles while Jacob held the ladder steady below. "Callaway," Beaumont called out, not bothering to dismount. "Didn't figure you for a man who'd let his wife do a hired hand's work while he stands around holding a ladder." Jacob's jaw went tight, and Abigail saw his hand close around the ladder rail hard enough to whiten his knuckles. But before he could answer, she called down from the roof herself, hammer still in hand. "He's not standing around, Mr. Beaumont. He's keeping me from breaking my neck, which strikes me as sensible division of labor. Perhaps you'd care to climb up and take a turn, since you've got opinions about how the roof ought to get fixed." Beaumont's horse shifted under him, and his face went the particular shade of red that men get when a woman has bested them in front of witnesses. "I've got better things to do than climb a Callaway roof." "Then I expect you've got better things to do than sit there commenting on how we run our own place," Abigail said, and turned back to her shingles like the conversation was already over, because as far as she was concerned, it was. Beaumont rode off without another word, but Jacob stood at the base of the ladder a long moment, looking up at her with an expression Abigail couldn't quite name, something between astonishment and pride, and a kind of tenderness he hadn't let himself show before, not once, not even the day the spring broke free. "You didn't have to defend me," he said once she'd climbed down. "I wasn't defending you," Abigail said. "I was defending sense. Beaumont's had it in for this ranch since before I arrived. I'd have said the same to him if you'd been off in town and I'd been up on that roof alone." "I don't believe you," Jacob said, and there was something almost like a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth, the first real one she'd seen on him since she'd arrived. "I think you'd have said it regardless, but I don't believe for a second you weren't thinking of me when you said it." Abigail felt heat climb into her face that had nothing to do with the summer sun, and she busied herself gathering her tools rather than answer him because she wasn't yet ready to admit how true that was not to him, and not entirely to herself either. That night over supper, that had grown considerably better than beans and hard bread. In the week since her arrival, Jacob set down his fork and looked at her across the table with a seriousness that made her still her own hands. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For what?" "For what I felt the day you stepped off that stagecoach." His voice was low, rough with the effort of honesty. "I looked at you, and I felt disappointed. God forgive me, I did. I'd built up some picture in my head of what I wanted, and you weren't it, and I let that show on my face before I ever gave you the chance to prove me a fool for feeling it." He shook his head. "I've been a fool plenty of times in my life, Miss Harper, but never quite so thoroughly as that." Abigail was quiet a moment, turning his words over, deciding how much of her own hurt to hand back to him. "I saw it," she admitted. "That look. I've seen it my whole life, Mr. Callaway, on my own kin's faces before yours. I've made my peace with the fact that most folks decide what I'm worth before I've said a word to them." "That ain't peace," Jacob said. "That's just practice at getting hurt without flinching. There's a difference." She looked up at him, startled that he'd seen so clean through something she'd never said aloud to anyone. "Maybe there is," she allowed. "You're the reason this ranch is still standing," he said. "You're the reason I've got a spring running again that's been dry longer than I've been alive. You're the reason Whitfield stopped robbing me blind and Beaumont's stopped circling like a buzzard waiting for the last breath. I was a fool to feel disappointed. I'd have been a bigger fool to let that foolishness show long enough to lose you." Abigail's throat tightened, and she was grateful for the lamplight dim enough to hide whatever her face was doing that she hadn't given it permission to do. "You haven't lost me, Mr. Calloway." "Jacob," he said. "I reckon we've earned first names by now." "Jacob," she said, testing the shape of it, and found she liked it a good deal more than she'd expected to. They sat with that a while. The two of them, the ledger pushed aside. For once the letters from the bank still unanswered, but no longer quite so frightening now that there were two people at the table instead of one. Outside the cattle, Abigail had helped nurse back onto decent grazing, load low and content in the dark, and the spring ran clean through a trench that was at last being dug the rest of the way through to the lower pasture, finishing what a dead man had started, and his son had never quite believed could be finished at all. 90 days was not so very long, and the bank's letter still sat unanswered on the shelf, and Cyrus Beaumont had not stopped circling just because he'd been sent off a roof in humiliation once. But for the first time since the stagecoach door had opened onto a street full of laughing strangers, Abigail Harper sat at a table in a cabin that was slowly, stubbornly becoming something like a home, and did not feel like a woman waiting to be sent away. She felt instead like a woman who had finally found ground worth standing on. The rains that should have come in early July did not come, and by the third week of the month, the grass Abigail had nursed back to green in the north pasture was already curling brown at the edges again, and she watched the sky every evening with the particular dread of a woman who had watched skies like that before and knew exactly what an empty one could cost a family. "It ain't looking good," Jacob said one evening, standing in the doorway with his hat still on, staring out at a horizon that offered nothing but heat shimmer and a sun going down red and dry. "It's not looking finished either," Abigail said, coming to stand beside him. "There's still time for it to turn." "You always this stubborn about hoping." "I'm stubborn about everything," she said. "Hoping's just the part of it that doesn't leave blisters." He huffed something that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so tired, and for a while they stood there together, not touching close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cooling evening air, and neither one of them moved to end it. 2 days later, the wind came, instead of rain, hot and hard out of the south, and it carried with it the smell of smoke long before either of them saw the first orange glow on the ridge above the Beaumont spread. "Grass fire," Jacob said, already moving, already shouting for the two hired hands who'd stayed on through the worst of the lean months out of loyalty, more than wages. "Wind's pushing it our way. We lose that north pasture, we lose the whole summer's grazing." Abigail did not hesitate. She was already pulling on her boots, already tying a wet kerchief over her mouth and nose, the way she'd seen her father do it during the Kansas fires that had taken half a season's wheat when she was a girl. "You ought to stay at the cabin," Jacob said, not quite an order more, a hope spoken out loud. "I ought to do a great many things I've never once done," Abigail said, "and staying inside while a fire eats my land isn't about to be the first of them." They fought that fire through the night, Abigail alongside the hired men, and Jacob beating flame with wet sacks, digging a firebreak with hands already blistered from fence work, hauling water from the spring she'd uncovered herself in buckets that felt heavier with every trip. Her arms shook by midnight. Her lungs burned from smoke thick enough to taste. But she did not stop, would not stop, because stopping meant watching everything they'd built in 2 months of stubborn labor turn to ash in a single night, and she had already lost too much in her life to things that burned to lose this too without a fight. It was near dawn when the wind finally shifted, pushing the fire back on itself, starving it against the firebreak they'd dug, raw-handed through the dark. Jacob found her sitting in the ash-gray grass afterward, face streaked black with soot, hands wrapped in strips torn from her own petticoat, because the blisters had broken and bled, and she hadn't stopped long enough to notice until the fire was out. "Let me see," he said, kneeling in front of her, and his voice had gone soft in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Soft the way a man's voice goes when fear has just barely finished passing through him and left something tender in its wake. "It's nothing," Abigail said. "Just blisters." "It's not nothing." He took her hands gently, turning them palm up in the gray light, and his jaw tightened at what he saw there. You could have stayed at the cabin and let you and 2 hired men fight a fire alone that was as much a threat to me as to you." She shook her head. "I don't know how to stand back and watch Jacob. Never have. It isn't in me." He looked at her a long moment, still holding her ruined hands in his careful ones, and something passed over his face that she had never once seen there before. Something raw and unguarded, stripped bare by exhaustion and relief, and the particular clarity that comes after a night of believing you might lose everything. "I near lost my mind out there," he said quietly, "thinking you might get caught in it, thinking I might turn around and not see you." Abigail's breath caught. "Jacob, I know it ain't proper saying it plain like this," he said, "but I'm too tired to dress it up prettier than it is. I've come to need you here, not for the ledgers, not for the fences. I've come to need you, and it scares me worse than any fire because I already buried one woman I needed, and I don't know that I've got the strength to do it twice." The words hung between them in the smoke-thinned air, and Abigail felt something crack open in her chest that she had kept locked tight since she was a girl, learning not to expect kindness from anyone who looked at her twice. She had come to this ranch expecting nothing more than a roof and a purpose. She had not let herself hope for this, had not dared to, because hope was a luxury she'd learned to ration carefully after a lifetime of watching it go unrewarded. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and her voice shook only a little. "Fire nor bank nor Cyrus Beaumont himself is going to run me off this land, Jacob Calloway. I've buried my own dreams of being wanted more times than I care to count, and I'll be damned if I let a grass fire be the thing that finally does it." He laughed. Then, rough and real, and it broke something loose in both of them. Some final wall. Neither had quite admitted to building, and for a moment, kneeling together in ash and dawn light, with her ruined hands still held in his. The 90 days on the bank's letter, and the unfinished trench, and the whole uncertain future of the Calloway Ranch seemed a smaller thing than it had the night before. It did not stay small for long. Cyrus Beaumont rode over 3 days later. Not with the easy contempt he'd worn the day he'd found her on the roof, but with something sharper, more deliberate, and Abigail knew trouble the moment she saw the paper folded in his coat pocket. "Calloway," he said, dismounting this time, which told her plainer than words that whatever he'd come to say he intended to enjoy, saying it up close. "Heard about your fire. Shame that. Heard you nearly lost the whole north pasture." "We didn't lose it," Jacob said evenly. "What do you want, Cyrus?" Beaumont smiled slow and unpleasant and pulled the folded paper from his pocket. "I've been talking with the bank. Seems they're nervous about your note, what with fires and drought and all manner of bad luck following this place around lately. I made them an offer, full payoff of your debt plus a fair price for the land on top of it. You could be shut of this whole mess by month's end, Calloway. No more 90-day letters. No more fires in the night." Jacob's hand found Abigail's without either of them quite deciding to reach for the other, and she felt the tension running through him like a live wire. "This is my father's land," Jacob said. "It ain't for sale. It will be," Beaumont said, unbothered, "the day that note comes due, and you can't cover it. I'm just offering you the dignity of choosing the manner of your own ruin, Calloway, instead of having the bank choose it for you." His eyes slid to Abigail, and his smile turned uglier. "Course maybe your wife here's got some scheme to save you. She seems the scheming sort." "I've got no scheme," Abigail said, stepping forward, before Jacob could answer her voice steady, despite the fury climbing hot behind her ribs. "I've got arithmetic, Mr. Beaumont, and eyes that read a ledger a good deal more carefully than most men bother to. This ranch is not for sale. Not to you, not to the bank, not to anybody. And I'd thank you to take your offer, and your insults back, over your own fence line." Beaumont's jaw tightened, and for a moment something ugly flickered behind his eyes, the look of a man unused to being refused, especially by a woman he'd already decided didn't merit refusing anyone anything. "You've got 90 days, Calloway. Less now, I expect, given the state of your grazing. I'll be here when the clock runs out." He mounted his horse and rode off without waiting for an answer, and Abigail stood watching the dust of his departure, with her jaw set and her ruined hands curled into fists at her sides. "He means it," Jacob said quietly. He's wanted this land longer than I've been alive. My pa turned down 3 offers from his father before him. Beaumont's just been waiting for a Calloway weak enough to finally say yes. Then we'll have to make sure he keeps waiting, Abigail said. 90 days, Abigail. We're not even halfway to fixing what's broken here. We fixed a spring nobody thought could be uncapped, she said, turning to face him fully, her eyes fierce in a way that made him go still. We fixed a fraud nobody thought to question. We fought a fire nobody thought we'd survive. I did not travel 11 days on a stagecoach to watch a man like Cyrus Beaumont take what your father built because we ran out of time being afraid of him. We are going to find a way, Jacob Calloway, because I have never once in my life given up on a piece of ground worth fighting for, and I don't intend to start with this one. Jacob looked at her a long moment, something fierce and grateful and disbelieving all at once, moving across his face like a man who had spent years bracing for the ground to fall away beneath him, and had just discovered for the first time that he was standing on rock instead. My pa used to say the trench he started in the lower pasture would double our hay yield if it ever got finished, he said slowly. Never had the money nor the hands to finish it. Reckon that's part of why we've always run short come winter. Then that's where we start, Abigail said. Tomorrow. 90 days is enough time to finish what your father started if we don't waste a single one of them feeling sorry for ourselves. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, already composing in her head the list of what they'd need, the hands they'd have to hire on credit and goodwill alone. The neighbors who might yet be convinced to help a ranch they'd spent years mocking, and behind her, she heard Jacob's footsteps following quicker than usual, like a man chasing something he'd only just realized he couldn't afford to let get too far ahead of him. That night, she sat again at the kitchen table with the ledger open before her. But this time, Jacob sat beside her, instead of across from her, close enough that their shoulders touched when either of them leaned forward, and together they worked out figures long past the hour when either of them should have gone to bed. 90 days. $400. A trench half dug, and a pasture scarred by fire, and a neighbor circling like he already owned the deed. It should have felt impossible. It did not feel impossible. It felt for the first time since Abigail Harper had stepped off a stagecoach into a street full of strangers who'd already decided her worth before she said a word like a fight she was not facing alone. Word of the fire spread through Clearwater Crossing faster than the fire itself had spread through the north pasture, and with it spread a different kind of talk than Abigail had grown used to hearing about herself. She heard it first from the mercantile clerk, the same thin young man who'd stared at her that first day, like she'd sprouted a second head, who now greeted her by name, and told her without being asked that half the town had heard how she'd fought that fire bare-handed alongside Jacob Calloway and his hired men, rather than sit safe inside a cabin. "Folks are saying you've got sand, Mrs. Calloway," he said, catching himself. "Beg pardon, Miss Harper." "Soon enough it won't be a mistake to call me the first," Abigail said, and found she did not mind the slip nearly as much as she might have expected to. Not everyone had softened. She still caught the same sideways glances from certain women in town, still heard the same cruel murmuring when she passed too close to a knot of gossiping wives outside the church on Sunday. But there were others now, a widow named Mrs. Petrie, who ran the boarding house and had lost her own husband to a banknote, not unlike the one hanging over the Calloway Ranch, who stopped Abigail on the boardwalk one morning and pressed her hand and said only, "You keep fighting, dear. Somebody ought to beat Cyrus Beaumont at something, and I'd sooner it be you than anybody else in this valley." It was Mrs. Petrie, in fact, who first mentioned that her late husband's brother ran a small outfit 2 valleys over and had 2 grown sons idle between planting seasons, who might hire on cheap for a summer's hard labor if the Calloway Ranch could feed them and pay them something come harvest. Abigail rode out to see them herself the following week ledger and a signed promise of fair wages in hand, and came home with 2 more sets of hands willing to dig trench for a share of the coming hay crop, instead of coin they knew the ranch didn't have. "You're building an army," Jacob said, half amused, half something else, watching her cross names off a list at the kitchen table each night. "I'm building a harvest," Abigail said. "The army's just how we get there. The trench work began in earnest, the first week of August, and it was punishing labor, the kind that left every man and woman on that ranch aching down to the bone by sundown. But Abigail worked beside them from first light sleeves, rolled palms wrapped in fresh cloth over blisters that had only just begun to heal from the fire. She measured the grade herself with a level borrowed from Mrs. Petrie's brother-in-law, correcting the old unfinished cuts where Jacob's father had misjudged the fall of the land decades before. And more than once she caught Jacob simply watching her work, not with the doubt of that first day on the stagecoach road, but with something that had settled over the weeks into plain and open admiration. "You know," he said one evening, the two of them sitting on the cabin steps with the last of the daylight fading gold over a trench now more than half dug. "When I wrote that letter to the agency, I told myself all I wanted was somebody to sweep the floors and not complain about the loneliness." "I remember," Abigail said. "You were plain about it." "I was a fool about it," Jacob said. "I didn't know what I wanted, Abigail. I knew what I thought I could stand to ask for. There's a difference, same as you told me once about peace and practice." He looked at her steady and unflinching in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. "I asked for someone to sweep my cabin because I didn't believe I deserved to ask for anything more. You gave me a reason to believe I might." Abigail did not trust her voice enough to answer right away. She sat with the weight of what he'd said, the trench stretching dark and half-finished before them. The bank's letter still sitting unanswered on the shelf inside Cyrus Beaumont's 90 days, ticking steadily down toward a reckoning neither of them could yet be certain they'd survive. But beside her sat a man who had stopped seeing her as a disappointment the day she stepped off that stagecoach and had come slowly, stubbornly to see her instead, as the reason his father's unfinished work might finally be finished. The reason his ranch might yet outlast the men who'd spent years waiting for it to fail. "We're not done yet," she said, finally nodding toward the trench. "Best not go soft on me now, Jacob Calloway. We've got a harvest to save and a Beaumont to beat, and neither one of those gets done by sitting on porch steps saying pretty things, however much I might like to hear them." Jacob laughed low and warm, and reached over to take her ruined, blistered hand in his, without asking permission. And Abigail let him. Because for the first time in a life spent bracing for rejection before it arrived, she found she no longer needed to brace for anything at all. The trench ran on another quarter-mile before the ground gave way to darkness, and the day's labor finally ended, and Abigail Harper walked back toward the cabin that night with mud to her knees and blisters on both hands, and a bone-deep certainty settling into her chest that had nothing to do with ledgers or fences or fraudulent feed bills. She had come to Clearwater Crossing a woman the whole town had laughed at, a burden nobody believed a rancher could want. She was leaving that summer evening, a woman who intended to save the ranch, beat the man circling it like a vulture, and build out of drought and fire, and a dead man's unfinished trench. Something no one in that valley would ever again dare call worthless. They rode home with the conversation sitting sour between them, and it was Abigail who broke the silence first. Her mind already working the way it worked over ledgers, looking for the crack in the wall rather than the wall itself. "He wants proof," she said. "Then we'll get proof. If Beaumont's behind this, he didn't do it with his own two hands. A man like that pays somebody else to take the risk. And a man who pays somebody else leaves a trail, same as Whitfield's false billing left a trail. Money always leaves a trail, Jacob. Always. You aim to go looking for it. I aim to keep my eyes open," Abigail said. "And I'd like you to keep yours open too, especially around any new hired hands showing up at the Beaumont spread, or any of our own hands who start spending money they didn't have last week." It was a hard thing to hear, harder still to consider, but Jacob nodded, slow, understanding the shape of what she was suggesting even before she said it plain, that the fire and the fence might not have been the work of a stranger at all, but of someone closer, someone who knew the ranch's rhythms well enough to strike where it would hurt worst. The suspicion did not have long to wait for confirmation. 10 days later, one of the two younger hired hands, a nervous boy named Ezra, who'd been quieter than most since the fire came to Abigail, while she was hanging wash near the cabin, twisting his hat in his hands like a man carrying a weight he could no longer bear alone. "Miss Harper," he said, voice cracking, I gotta tell you something, and I reckon it might get me run off this ranch for good, but I can't sleep with it no more." Abigail set down the wet shirt in her hands and gave him her full attention, the way she'd give attention to a ledger with numbers that didn't add up. "Go on. Man came to me in town 3 weeks back. Offered me $10 to leave the north gate open one night, said nobody'd notice a few head wandering. I said no. But he came back after, offered me 20 to look the other way if somebody else came round after dark. I said no to that too, but..." His voice broke entirely. "I think my cousin took the money instead. Silas. I think it was him let that fire get started, or told somebody the layout of the barn at least. I ain't got proof. I just know he's been flush with cash he can't account for, and he's been avoiding my eye since the night it happened." Abigail's blood went cold and still, the particular stillness of a woman staring straight at a betrayal she hadn't wanted to believe was possible. "Who was the man that offered you the money?" "Never got a name," Ezra said miserably. "Big fellow, city clothes, rode a horse I didn't recognize. But he came out of the direction of the Beaumont spread both times, Miss Harper. I'd swear to it on my mother's grave." She thanked him for his honesty, told him plainly that she believed him, and that his honesty would not cost him his place on the ranch, and watched him walk away with his shoulders sagging in relief before she went to find Jacob with a fury building cold and controlled behind her ribs. "Silas," Jacob repeated, when she told him, disbelief and anger warring across his face. "He's been eating at our table all summer. He's also been broke all summer, right up until the week the barn caught fire," Abigail said. "I want to talk to him myself before you do anything you can't take back." "Abigail." "I mean it, Jacob. If we run him off without proof, Beaumont learns we're on to him and covers his tracks tighter. If I can get Silas to admit what he did, we've got something to bring Dunmore that isn't just a hunch." Jacob's jaw worked the war between his fury and her logic plain on his face, but he nodded because he had learned over the long weeks of that summer that Abigail Harper's cold reasoning had never once led them wrong. She found Silas mending harness near the barn, and she sat down across from him without preamble, watching his hands go still on the leather the moment he registered the look on her face. "I know about the money," she said quietly. "I know a man came to you from the Beaumont place, and I know Ezra didn't take his offer, but I suspect you did. I'm not here to have you arrested, Silas. I'm here because I want the truth, and because I think somewhere under whatever fear or desperation made you take that money, there's a decent man who doesn't actually want to watch this ranch burn to the ground." Silas's hands shook on the harness. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and Abigail let the silence stretch patient, as she'd always been, because she had learned that guilt given enough room tended to speak for itself eventually. "My ma's sick," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Bill's back home in Ohio. I've been sending every dollar I earn, and it ain't near enough. Man found me in town, said all I had to do was leave a gate open, said nobody'd get hurt, just a few cattle scattered easy money. I said no to that. But then he came back with more. Said all I had to do was tell him where the hay was stacked. Thinnest against the barn wall. Said it wasn't my hands lighting anything. Just information. And God forgive me, Miss Harper, I told him. I didn't think he'd actually..." His voice cracked entirely. "I didn't think anybody'd get hurt. I didn't think about you and Mr. Calloway sleeping 20 yards from that barn. But you thought about it enough to take his money twice," Abigail said, not unkind, but not soft either. "Yes, ma'am." Tears cut clean tracks through the dust on his face. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I'll leave tonight, I won't cause you no more trouble." "You'll do no such thing," Abigail said, surprising him. Surprising herself a little too. "You're going to tell Sheriff Dunmore exactly what you just told me in exactly those words. And you're going to describe that man in enough detail that we can prove where he came from. And then if you're willing to keep working this ranch honest from here forward, you're going to help us finish that trench, because your ma's medical bills don't get any smaller if you run off in shame tonight and leave us short-handed." Silas stared at her like she'd offered him something he hadn't believed still existed in the world. "You'd let me stay after what I'd done. I've been given up on by people who never gave me the chance to prove I was worth a second look," Abigail said. "I don't aim to do that to somebody who's willing to make it right. but I mean what I said about Dunmore. You tell him the truth, all of it, or I go to him myself and you lose more than a chance to stay." Silas told Dunmore everything the following morning, description and all. A broad-shouldered man with a scar through one eyebrow. City boots. A horse with a distinctive white sock on its off foreleg. A man who'd introduced himself only as working for an interested party. And though it still wasn't enough to charge Beaumont directly, Dunmore's face had changed by the time Silas finished talking, gone from bored to genuinely troubled, and he promised to keep a closer watch on the Callaway spread going forward. It was, Abigail told Jacob that night, a start. Not a victory, a start. The victory, when it came, arrived from a direction neither of them expected. Mrs. Petrie, delivering a fresh batch of preserves to the ranch, in gratitude for the wages her nephews had earned. Honest work mentioned almost in passing that her late husband's old friend, a land surveyor named Halloran, who'd retired to Clearwater Crossing 2 years back, had once done survey work on the Beaumont spread, and had grumbled for years about how Cyrus Beaumont had shorted him on payment for a boundary survey he'd never fully settled. "Man still bitter about it," Mrs. Petrie said. "Talks about it every Sunday after church if you let him get started." Abigail rode out to see Halloran the very next day, and found a stooped, sharp-eyed old man who lit up like a lantern the moment she asked him about Cyrus Beaumont's business dealings. "That man's been trying to swallow this valley whole for 20 years, Halloran said, settling into his porch chair with the eager relish of a man finally given an audience for a grudge he'd nursed for 2 decades. "Buys up notes cheap from the bank when ranchers go under, then squeezes the land for everything it's got before selling it off in pieces at triple what he paid. I surveyed 3 of his acquisitions myself before he stiffed me on the 4th. Ellison spread Carmichael Place, the old Weatherby claim, all of them went the same way. Beaumont buys the debt, quiet waits for the rancher to default, then swoops in looking like a savior, when really, he's the vulture that circled the whole time. Can you prove any of that?" Abigail asked, her pulse quickening. "Prove it." "I surveyed the boundary changes myself, ma'am. Got copies of every plat I ever drew for that man filed proper with the county, same as the law requires. If you want to see how many times Cyrus Beaumont's bought a struggling rancher's debt out from under the original bank, before the ink on the foreclosure was even dry, the county recorder's office has the paper trail sitting right there for anybody patient enough to dig through it." Abigail felt something click into place in her chest, the particular electric satisfaction of a woman who has just found the loose thread that could unravel an entire scheme. "Mr. Halloran," she said, "I would be very grateful if you'd be willing to help me go through those records." He grinned, showing a gap where a tooth had once been. "Ma'am, I've been waiting 20 years for somebody to finally ask." They spent 3 days at the county recorder's office. Abigail and Halloran hunched over dusty ledgers and filed plats, while a clerk, who clearly disapproved of a woman poring over legal documents, kept finding excuses to hover nearby. And by the end of the 3rd day, Abigail had built a record that made her hands shake with something between fury and triumph. 4 separate ranches over the past 15 years. Each one bought out from under a defaulting rancher by Cyrus Beaumont, within days of foreclosure. Each purchase made at a price well below fair market value. Each transaction suspiciously timed to arrive just after some manner of misfortune had struck the ranch in question. A barn fire at the Ellison place. A poisoned well at the Carmichael spread. Cattle scattered and never recovered at the Weatherby claim. "It's not a coincidence," Abigail said that night, spreading her notes across the kitchen table for Jacob to see, her voice tight with the effort of staying calm. "Every single ranch he's swallowed had some manner of disaster right before the sale. Fires, fences cut, wells fouled. Same pattern as us, Jacob, 4 times over before he ever got to our door." Jacob read through her notes in silence, his face growing paler with each page. And when he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes that Abigail hadn't seen there before. Not fear exactly, but the cold clarity of a man finally understanding the true shape of the enemy he was up against. "He's done this before," Jacob said slowly. "He's done this exact thing 4 times, and got away with it clean every time. 4 times that we know of," Abigail said. And each time the ranchers who lost their land were too broken by the disaster to fight back, too busy grieving what they'd lost to notice the pattern connecting it to the man who profited from it. But we noticed. I noticed, Abigail said, because I was looking for it. Because I don't believe in coincidence, not when it comes wearing a rich man's boots. Jacob sat back slowly, running a hand over his face, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke the weight of what they'd uncovered, settling heavy over the kitchen table between them. "This ain't proof he set our fire," Jacob said finally. "Or cut our fence." "No," Abigail agreed. "But it's proof of a pattern, and patterns matter to a county assessor, even when they don't matter to a lazy sheriff. If we can show that 4 ranches went under to Beaumont's advantage in suspiciously similar circumstances, and that we're now the 5th ranch experiencing that exact same pattern, that's enough to force a real investigation. That's enough to make it very hard for Beaumont to buy our note the moment it comes due, because suddenly every eye in the county assessor's office is watching how he does business." Jacob reached across the table and took her hand, his grip fierce, his voice rough with something that sounded to Abigail's ears dangerously close to awe. "You've been on this ranch 4 months, and you've done more to protect it than I managed in the 4 years since my pa died. I had more reason to fight for it than you knew I had," Abigail said quietly. "I came here because nobody back home believed I was worth marrying for anything but desperation. I'm not about to let a man like Cyrus Beaumont prove them right by taking this place out from under us while I stood by feeling sorry for myself." The bank letter arrived 2 days later, and for one gut-wrenching moment standing at the mailbox with the envelope in her hand, Abigail believed it was the 90-day deadline. Finally come due early, some cruel acceleration engineered by Beaumont's money and influence. She tore it open with hands that had gone unsteady, and read it twice before the words settled into sense. It was not a foreclosure notice. It was a notice that the bank's president himself, a man named Corwin, who Abigail had never met, wished to meet with Jacob Calloway at his earliest convenience regarding irregularities recently brought to the bank's attention concerning the handling of certain agricultural notes in this county. "Halloran!" Abigail breathed, understanding dawning fast and fierce. "He didn't just help us dig through those records for our sake. He must have taken a copy straight to the bank himself." Jacob read the letter twice, his hands shaking now too, and when he looked up at her, there was something raw and unguarded on his face. Hope so naked it looked almost like pain. "If the bank's looking into Beaumont's dealings," he said slowly, "if they find what we found, then Beaumont's scheme to buy our note out from under us falls apart," Abigail finished, "because no bank president wants his name attached to a scandal that makes half the county wonder how many families he helped a land baron rob blind." They rode into town together the following morning, Abigail's careful documentation tucked in a leather folder under her arm. And if Cyrus Beaumont had built his fortune on the assumption that the women married into failing ranches would be too broken or too meek to ever look past their own kitchen windows, he had never once accounted for a woman like Abigail Harper, who had spent a lifetime being underestimated, and had learned long before she ever set foot on a stagecoach bound for Montana, exactly how dangerous a woman could be once she stopped waiting for permission to fight. Bank President Corwin turned out to be a thin, careful man who listened to Abigail's presentation of 4 county land records with the particular stillness of a man watching his own reputation teeter on a ledge. And by the time she finished laying out the pattern, the fires, the fouled wells, the scattered cattle, the suspiciously timed purchases that always arrived within days of a family's ruin, his face had gone the color of old paper. "Miss Harper," he said carefully, "these are serious allegations." "They're not allegations, Mr. Corwin. They're county records filed and dated sitting in your own recorder's office for anybody with the patience to look. I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. I'm asking you to look at the pattern with your own eyes and ask yourself whether you want your bank's name attached to a 5th ruined family when the first 4 are already sitting there in black and white for anyone to find." Corwin was quiet a long moment, his fingers steepled before him, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its careful neutrality entirely. Mr. Beaumont approached this bank 3 weeks ago, offering to purchase your note in full, Mr. Calloway, the moment it comes due. I confess, I found the offer generous. I did not think to ask why a man would pay above market value for a note on a struggling ranch, when 4 other ranches in this county have somehow ended up in his hands for a fraction of their worth. Because it was never generosity, Abigail said. It was appetite. Corwin looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his careful banker's eyes, and when he spoke again, it was with the tone of a man who had just decided which side of a very dangerous line he intended to stand on. I will be initiating a formal review of every note this bank has sold or transferred to Mr. Beaumont over the past 15 years, he said. And in the meantime, Mr. Calloway, I am prepared to extend the deadline on your note by an additional 60 days, given the extraordinary circumstances you and your wife have brought to my attention, and given that any transfer of your debt to a party currently under investigation would be at minimum extremely poor judgment on this bank's part. Jacob's hand found Abigail's under the table, gripping so tight it nearly hurt, and Abigail felt something surge through her chest that was not quite triumph, and not quite relief, but some fierce, unfamiliar mixture of both the particular feeling of a woman who has just watched a door she'd been told was permanently shut swing open on hinges she had oiled herself. They rode home in near silence, both of them too full of feeling to trust themselves to words. And it wasn't until the ranch came into view, the trench stretching dark and nearly finished across the lower pasture, the barn still standing. Despite the fire that had tried to take it, the fences mended, and the cattle grazing green grass they'd fought for with their own hands, that Jacob finally spoke. 60 more days, he said. 60 more days, and Beaumont can't touch the note without the whole county watching him do it. 60 more days is enough time to finish the trench, bring in the hay, and make sure this ranch can stand on its own feet, regardless of what any bank decides, Abigail said. We're not out of danger yet, Jacob. Beaumont's not a man who gives up a scheme he's run successfully 4 times before just because one banker got nervous. No. Jacob agreed, his jaw tightening again, the brief lightness of their victory already giving way to the harder truth beneath it. A man like that don't give up. He just changes tactics. He was right to worry. That very evening, as the sun dropped low and gold over the half-finished trench, a rider came tearing up the road at a dangerous gallop, and Abigail's stomach dropped before she even recognized Ezra's face, pale and terrified, his horse lathered white with the effort of the ride. "Mr. Calloway!" he shouted, near falling from the saddle in his haste. "You got to come quick. Silas is hurt bad down at the lower fence, and there's a man out there, a stranger. I seen him ride off toward the Beaumont place the second Silas went down." Jacob was already moving, already shouting for his rifle, already swinging up onto his own horse before Ezra had finished the sentence, and Abigail, without a single moment's hesitation, gathered her skirts and mounted Duke behind him, because whatever waited for them at the lower fence, she had no intention of finding out about it secondhand from the safety of the cabin. They found Silas crumpled in the dirt near the fence line, blood soaking dark through his shirt from a wound at his shoulder, his face white with shock, and beside him, half hidden in the grass, a torn scrap of paper that had clearly fallen from someone's pocket in a hurried escape. A paper with numbers scrawled on it in a careful, educated hand, numbers that when Abigail knelt to snatch it up with trembling fingers, made her blood run cold with recognition. It was a partial ledger of payments, dates, amounts, and at the bottom, unmistakable even in the fading light, 3 initials that made her breath catch hard in her throat. C.B. Jacob. Abigail's voice came out low, urgent, the scrap of paper trembling between her fingers. "Look at this." He was already kneeling beside Silas, pressing his own neckerchief hard against the wound to slow the bleeding, but he glanced up at what she held out, and his face went through several changes in the space of a single breath. Confusion, then recognition, then a fury so cold and complete that Abigail felt it radiating off him like heat from a stove. "That's Beaumont's hand," he said. "I've seen his signature on enough grazing disputes to know it anywhere. We need a doctor," Abigail said, forcing herself back to the more urgent matter, because rage could wait, but blood loss couldn't. Ezra, ride for Doc Sherman. Tell him it's a gunshot wound and to hurry. Jacob helped me get pressure on this properly. We need to get him back to the cabin before he loses much more blood." Silas's eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain and shock. "Man came at me sudden," he rasped. "Said Beaumont wanted to know if I'd talked to anybody else besides the sheriff. When I told him to go to hell, he drew on me. Never even gave me a chance to run." "You don't have to explain now," Abigail said gently, cutting a strip from her own petticoat for the second time that summer to bind a wound that wasn't hers, pressing it firm against Silas's shoulder, while Jacob lifted him carefully onto the back of his own horse. "Save your strength. We'll get you fixed up, and then Sheriff Dunmore is going to hear every word of this whether he wants to or not." They got Silas back to the cabin, just as Ezra returned with Doc Sherman, a weathered man who'd clearly seen his share of gunshot wounds in a valley where disputes were still occasionally settled with something other than words. And while the doctor worked by lamplight to dig a bullet from Silas's shoulder, Abigail sat at the kitchen table with the torn scrap of paper spread before her, studying it with the same fierce concentration she'd once turned on Jacob's fraudulent ledgers. "It's a payment record," she said, half to herself, half to Jacob, who paced the small kitchen, unable to sit still while the doctor worked in the next room. "Dates going back nearly a year. Small amounts mostly. $5 here, 10 there, and then larger sums right before the fire. This isn't just proof he paid somebody to hurt Silas tonight, Jacob. This looks like it might be proof he's been paying for information and sabotage on our ranch since the very week I arrived." "Since the week you arrived." Jacob stopped pacing, staring at her. "You think he's been planning this since before you even got here? I think a man who swallowed 4 ranches the same way doesn't wait for opportunity, Jacob. He manufactures it." Abigail's jaw tightened. "He probably heard you'd written to a mail-order agency and started laying groundwork the same week, betting that whatever woman arrived would either run off within a month like the others before her or stay long enough to watch the ranch fail around her anyway. He didn't count on you." "No." Abigail said, something fierce and cold settling into her voice. "He didn't." Doc Sherman emerged an hour later, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression grim, but not without hope. "Bullets out. He lost a fair amount of blood, but the wound missed anything vital. He'll need rest, and he'll carry a scar, but he'll live." He glanced between Jacob and Abigail, taking in the tension still thick in the room. "I heard him talking some before the laudanum took hold proper. Sounded like he was accusing a man of some standing in this county of ordering it." "That true?" "It's true," Jacob said. "And we've got evidence to back it, Doc. Real evidence, not just a wounded man's word." Doc Sherman's face hardened. "Then you'd best get it to Dunmore tonight before anybody has a chance to make that evidence disappear the same way 3 witnesses have disappeared from this county over the years, whenever they got too close to certain land dealings." The words landed heavy in the small kitchen, and Abigail felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. "Witnesses have disappeared. Nothing ever proven," Doc Sherman said carefully. "Man moves on, folks say. Changed his mind about testifying, folks say. I've patched up enough men in this valley over the years to have my own opinions about how often that particular kind of moving on happens right before a land sale goes through clean." He picked up his bag, weary. "You two watch yourselves. A man who's gotten away with what you're describing 4 times isn't going to let a 5th slip through his fingers without a fight uglier than cut fences and small fires." He left them with that warning hanging in the lamplit kitchen, and Abigail found herself reaching for Jacob's hand, without quite deciding to needing the solid warmth of him after a night that had gone from triumph to terror and back to something uncertain in between. "I'm not sending you into town alone with this evidence," Jacob said quietly. "Not after what Doc Sherman just said." "I wasn't planning to go alone," Abigail said. "But I do intend to go, Jacob, tonight if Dunmore will see us, because every hour that scrap of paper sits in this kitchen is an hour Beaumont has to figure out it's missing and start covering his tracks." They rode into Clearwater Crossing under a moon just past full. Silas resting fitfully back at the cabin under Ezra's careful watch, and found Sheriff Dunmore roused from his supper by the urgency in Jacob's knock, his irritation fading fast into something graver once he saw the torn ledger page and heard the full account of Silas's shooting. "This changes things," Dunmore admitted, studying the initials scrawled at the bottom of the page. "This changes things considerable. A cut fence is one thing. A man shot on your property with evidence tying the shooter's employer to a pattern of payments is a different matter entirely." He set the paper down carefully, like it might still bite him if handled wrong. "I'll ride out to the Beaumont place myself in the morning. Ask him some hard questions." "He'll deny it," Abigail said. "He'll have an explanation ready for every dollar on that page before you've finished your first question." "Maybe," Dunmore allowed. "But he can't explain away a shot man and a witness prepared to name names in front of a judge not forever. And with the bank already looking into his dealings on 4 other properties, this is one thread too many for even a man like Beaumont to keep untangled." He looked at Abigail with something that might have been grudging respect. "You've built a case here most lawyers would be proud of, Miss Harper. I'll not pretend I believed you and Calloway the first time you came to me about Cutwire. I believe you now." They left the sheriff's office well past midnight, the town quiet and dark around them, and Abigail felt the weight of the whole long day finally settling into her bones. The fence sabotage, weeks past the fire, Silas's confession, and now his shooting. The county records unearthed with Halloran's bitter help, the bank president's careful reversal, and now Dunmore's grudging conversion from disinterest to something like an ally. "We're close," she said quietly, as they rode side by side beneath the moon. "I can feel it, Jacob. We're close to bringing the whole thing down around him." "Close ain't finished," Jacob said, and there was something taut and watchful in his voice that hadn't been there before. Silas took a bullet meant to silence him. "A cornered animal is more dangerous than a hunting one, Abigail. Beaumont spent 20 years building this scheme without ever once being caught. He's not going to let a housekeeper and a rancher's wife take it apart in a single summer without doing something a great deal worse than cutting fence wire." Abigail said nothing to that, because she knew he was right, and because some fears were better carried in silence than spoken aloud, where they might grow larger for the saying. She thought instead of the trench nearly finished now of the harvest waiting to be brought in of Silas, resting fitfully in the cabin, with a scar he'd carry the rest of his life, because he'd once been desperate enough to take a stranger's money, and brave enough in the end to tell the truth about it. They rode the last mile home in silence, the ranch rising dark and familiar against the star-scattered sky, and Abigail found herself scanning the shadows near the barn and the tree line beyond the pasture, with a wariness she hadn't carried before that night. Alert now to a danger that had stopped being abstract, the moment Silas's blood soaked dark through the dirt of the lower fence. Inside, Ezra reported Silas resting easier, the fever that had threatened in the first hour, after the doctor left, finally breaking towards something closer to ordinary sleep, and Abigail sat by his bedside a while before finally allowing herself to rest, watching the rise and fall of his breathing, thinking of Cyrus Beaumont, somewhere across the valley, cornered now in a way he had never been before, and wondering with a cold clarity that kept sleep at bay long into the night exactly how far a desperate man would go to keep 20 years of careful theft from finally coming due. Morning came gray and still. No wind stirring the trench grass, no smoke on the horizon, and for a while it seemed the valley itself was holding its breath alongside her. Jacob rode out early to check the herd rifle across his saddle now as a matter of habit rather than caution. And Abigail spent the quiet hours changing Silas's dressing and forcing broth past his lips, grateful for work that kept her hands busy while her mind circled endlessly back to the initials on that torn scrap of paper. It was past noon when Ezra came running from the road, breathless, pointing toward the ridge that separated Calloway land from the Beaumont spread, where a thin column of riders sat motionless against the sky, watching the ranch, the way a wolf watches a wounded herd patient, unhurried in no rush at all to close the distance. Abigail stood in the yard and watched them back, refusing to let her hands shake, refusing to give Cyrus Beaumont the satisfaction of seeing fear on a woman he had spent an entire summer trying and failing to frighten off his neighbor's land. They did not come closer. They simply watched, and then as the afternoon wore toward evening, they turned their horses and rode back over the ridge and out of sight, leaving nothing behind but the certainty settling cold and absolute in Abigail's chest that whatever came next would not arrive quietly, and would not arrive by half measures. "You don't have to say anything, Miss Harper," Halloran said, wiping soot from his brow. "You already said it plenty standing up to a man the rest of us were too scared to name out loud for 20 years. Least we can do is make sure his matches don't finish what his money started." It was that fire, more than any ledger or courtroom argument, that finally cracked the valley's long silence wide open. Word of it spread faster than the flames themselves had, and by the following morning, 3 more families Abigail had never approached came to the ranch of their own accord, offering statements, offering memories they'd buried for years, out of fear, offering at long last their voices. Dunmore rode out to the Beaumont spread 3 mornings later, and Abigail spent every hour of his absence unable to settle to any task longer than it took to abandon it, for another moving from the kitchen to the barn, to Silas's bedside, and back again. Her mind circling the ridge where those riders had sat watching, like they were counting the days left on a debt only they could see. He came back near dusk, and one look at his face told Abigail the news wasn't the clean victory she'd let herself hope for. "Beaumont's got a lawyer out of Helena?" Dunmore said, dismounting stiff and tired in the yard. "Man arrived same morning I did, like he'd been sent for ahead of time. Denied everything, of course. Said the payment ledger's a forgery. Said if anybody tries to connect him to Silas's shooting, he'll sue this county for slander and ruin every man fool enough to testify against him." "That's a threat, not a defense," Abigail said, though her stomach had gone tight and cold. "It's both," Dunmore said. "And it's working on half the town already. Whitfield's gone quiet on the feed account business, says maybe he misremembered the terms. 2 of the men who signed statements about cattle disappearing off the Weatherby place have suddenly recalled they can't be certain of dates after all." He shook his head, weary and disgusted in equal measure. "Man's got money enough to make memory itself unreliable, Miss Harper. I've seen it before. Never liked it any better the second time." Jacob's jaw had gone tight enough that a muscle jumped in his cheek. "So he walks free?" "Not yet," Dunmore said. "The bank's investigation is still moving, and Corwin ain't the type to back down easy once his own reputation's on the line. But I'll be honest with you both. A lawyer from Helena and a pocketbook deep as Beaumont's can drag a case out long past the point most folks have the stomach to keep fighting it." He left with that warning trailing behind him, and Abigail stood in the yard a long while after his horse had disappeared down the road, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel since the day she'd stepped off that stagecoach into a street full of laughing strangers. Not fear exactly, but the old familiar ache of watching a fight she believed she could win start slipping sideways into something murkier. "He's trying to outlast us," she said, finally turning to Jacob. "That's the whole strategy. Not to win the argument, just to make the argument cost more than we can afford to keep paying." "Then we don't stop paying," Jacob said. "No," Abigail agreed. "We don't." But cost, she would learn within the week, did not always announce itself as money. It announced itself first as silence, the mercantile clerk who'd once greeted her warmly, now finding urgent business in the back room when she came in for supplies. It announced itself as Mrs. Petrie's nephews, growing suddenly hesitant about finishing out the season, murmuring something about needing to get back to their own family's place before harvest, though Abigail suspected Beaumont's reach had found them same as it had found Whitfield. It announced itself worst of all as a letter from the county assessor's office informing Jacob that a formal complaint had been lodged against the Callaway Ranch's water rights, alleging that the newly dug trench diverted flow illegally from a shared aquifer, an allegation that, if upheld, could force them to fill in the very work that had saved their herd from drought. "He's suing us over the water," Jacob said, reading the letter twice, like he expected the words to rearrange themselves into something less absurd. "The water that saved this ranch from the exact kind of ruin he's been engineering for other folks for 15 years. "It's not really about the water," Abigail said, though her hands had gone cold reading it. "It's about tying us up in a fight that costs money and time we don't have, right when the bank's getting close to finishing its own investigation. He's trying to bury us in paper, the same way he's tried to bury us in fire and cut fence and a bullet in Silas's shoulder. He's just found a slower way to do it." "Slow's still dangerous," Jacob said. "We fight this in court and lose even a month, and Corwin's 60 days runs out before the assessors finished looking at 4 ranches worth of records." Abigail sat with that a long moment, turning it over the way she turned over every problem that had come at her since the day she arrived, looking not at the wall in front of her, but for the door somewhere in it that Beaumont hadn't thought to lock. "Then we don't fight it alone," she said finally. "You said yourself he's stolen from 4 ranches before us. Halloran's spent 20 years angry about being cheated. Doc Sherman spent years patching up men hurt by business dealings nobody could ever quite prove. Mrs. Petrie lost her husband to a banknote not unlike ours. There's a whole valley full of people who've been quietly harmed by this man, and quietly told themselves there was nothing to be done about it." She stood already reaching for her shawl. "I think it's time somebody asked them plainly whether that's still true." The proof of how dangerous Slow could be arrived 2 nights after the assessor's letter, when Abigail woke to Duke screaming in the corral, a sound so raw and terrified that she was out of bed and running before she'd fully understood why. Jacob was already ahead of her, rifle in hand, and together they burst into the yard to find 2 riders wheeling away from the hay barn at a hard gallop, and behind them catching fast along the base of the freshly stacked hay flame. "Not again," Abigail said, and there was fury in it now more than fear. The particular fury of a woman watching a man try to burn the same work twice because the first attempt hadn't finished the job. They fought it together, same as before. Buckets and wet sacks and desperate hands. But the hay caught faster than the barn wall ever had dry and eager. And for several long, terrible minutes, Abigail believed they were going to lose the whole season's cutting watch. 3 months of back-breaking labor go up in smoke, while Cyrus Beaumont's riders vanished laughing into the dark. Then came hoofbeats from the road, more than 2, more than a handful, and Abigail's heart lurched with fresh alarm until she made out Halloran's stooped shape leading a half-dozen riders into the yard, the Ellison son-in-law among them, 2 of Mrs. Petrie's neighbors' men who'd have laughed at her a summer ago now flinging themselves off their horses with buckets already in hand. "Saw the glow from the Ridge Road," Halloran shouted over the roar of the flames. "Figured a fire on Callaway land this time of year weren't likely to be accidental." They beat the blaze back together a dozen hands, where there had been 2, and though they lost a third of the new hay before the last ember died, they saved the rest, saved the barn, saved a season's harvest that Beaumont had clearly hoped to erase in one desperate night. "He's getting reckless," Jacob said afterward, surveying the scorched, smoking ruin of what had been their finest cutting. His voice raw from smoke and fury both. "A man that careful doing something this open, this close to a hearing. A man that careful is starting to panic," Abigail said. "Which means we're closer to bringing him down than even he wants to admit." She looked around at the soot-streaked faces of neighbors who owed her nothing, who'd ridden out in the middle of the night for a woman half the valley had mocked only months before, and something in her chest ached with a gratitude too large for words. "Thank you," she said simply to all of them. "I don't know how to say what this means." "You don't have to say anything, Miss Harper," Halloran said, wiping soot from his brow. "You already said it plenty standing up to a man the rest of us were too scared to name out loud for 20 years. Least we can do is make sure his matches don't finish what his money started." She spent the next 4 days riding the valley in a way she'd never had cause to before calling on the Ellison's surviving daughter, now married and living 2 ranches over, who wept when Abigail described the pattern Halloran had helped her uncover, and admitted her family had always suspected foul play in the fire that took their barn, but had never had proof enough to speak it aloud. She called on the Carmichael widow, who kept a small boarding room in town, and who, upon hearing Abigail's account of the poisoned well, went pale and produced from a trunk she hadn't opened in 3 years a stack of letters her late husband had written accusing Beaumont of exactly the scheme Abigail was now describing. Letters he'd never sent, because he'd died of a fever before he found the courage. By the end of the 4th day, Abigail had 4 families willing to speak 4 sets of documents, corroborating what she and Halloran had already unearthed at the county recorder's office, and a growing, unmistakable sense that the valley Cyrus Beaumont had spent 2 decades quietly terrorizing into silence was finally cautiously beginning to find its voice again. "You've built an army twice now this summer," Jacob said, when she laid the new evidence across the kitchen table, 4 families' worth of grief and suspicion, finally given shape and weight and dates. "I told you before, Abigail said. "I'm building a harvest. This is just the second kind." The water rights hearing was set for the following Tuesday, and Cyrus Beaumont arrived at the county courthouse in a fine gray suit with his Helena lawyer at his side, wearing the easy confidence of a man who had never once in 15 years of quiet theft been made to answer for any of it in a room full of witnesses. That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took Abigail to stand. She did not raise her voice. She had learned over a lifetime of being underestimated that a woman's fury landed harder delivered calm than delivered loud. And so she laid out the pattern in the same careful, unhurried tone she'd once used to read Jacob's fraudulent ledgers back to him at a kitchen table. 4 ranches, 4 disasters, 4 suspiciously timed purchases, and now a 5th ranch facing the exact same pattern, right down to a water rights complaint filed the very week the ranch's trench proved it might finally survive. "This isn't a water dispute, Your Honor," she said, addressing the circuit judge, who'd traveled in special for the hearing, a stern man named Hargrove, who Abigail had been told a reputation for having little patience for frivolous filings. "This is the 5th attempt by Cyrus Beaumont to manufacture a crisis convenient to his own acquisition of a struggling neighbor's land. I have sworn statements from the Ellison, Carmichael, and Weatherby families describing near-identical patterns of sabotage preceding Mr. Beaumont's purchase of their properties. I have county records documenting each transaction, and I have a hired man currently recovering from a gunshot wound sustained on Callaway land, prepared to testify that he was paid by an agent of Mr. Beaumont's to provide information used in an act of arson against this very ranch." The courtroom had gone very still. Beaumont's lawyer rose halfway from his chair, already objecting, already reaching for the language of slander and unproven allegation. But Judge Hargrove held up one hand, and the room fell silent again. "Mrs. Callaway," the judge began. "Miss Harper," Abigail corrected, quiet but firm, because some truths deserve to be spoken plain, even in a courtroom, especially in a courtroom. "I am not yet married to Mr. Callaway, Your Honor, though I have spent the better part of this summer defending his land, as though I already were. I mention it only because Mr. Beaumont's counsel has twice now referred to me as though my testimony carries less weight for want of a ring on my finger, and I would ask the court to note that the facts I've presented don't change regardless of what anyone calls me." A ripple of sound moved through the gallery, something that might have been a laugh if the room hadn't been so tense, and Abigail saw from the corner of her eye Jacob's jaw working against a smile he was clearly fighting to hold back. She turned back to the judge and produced Silas's written statement, sworn before Dunmore, and notarized in town 2 days prior, his hand still bandaged from the wound that had put the words on the page in the first place. "Your Honor, I'd ask the court to hear directly what Silas Petrie swore to under oath, since he's not yet strong enough to travel and testify in person." At the judge's nod, she read it plain without embellishment. The boy's own halting words about the man who'd come to him twice with money, about the second visit, and what it had cost him, about waking in the dirt of the lower fence with a bullet in his shoulder, and Beaumont's name, the last thing the shooter had spoken before he ran. By the time she finished, the gallery had gone graveyard quiet, and even Beaumont's lawyer had stopped scribbling notes, his pen resting forgotten against his papers. Beaumont's face, by contrast, had gone the particular shade of red she'd seen on it once before, the day she'd bested him from atop a barn roof. Except this time, there was no easy exit, no horse to mount and ride away on, just a courtroom full of neighbors. He'd spent 20 years quietly ruining all of them. Now watching him with the sharpened attention of people who had finally been given permission to remember what they'd always suspected. "Your Honor." "This is theater," Beaumont's lawyer said. "My client has never been formally charged with anything. These are unsubstantiated accusations from bitter neighbors and a woman with a personal stake in discrediting him. I have a personal stake in not losing my home to a man who's already stolen 4 others, Abigail said before the judge could respond. "I don't deny that. But personal stake doesn't make county records false. Mr. Beaumont's own initials on a payment ledger false, or 3 independent witnesses lying by coincidence. If your client is innocent, Your Honor, I'd welcome him explaining under oath why a man was seen riding from the direction of his property minutes after Silas Petrie was shot on Callaway land, carrying a torn scrap of paper bearing Mr. Beaumont's own handwriting. The room had gone electric now, the particular charged silence of an audience that senses a story about to turn, and Judge Hargrove leaned forward, studying Beaumont with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the last several minutes from polite skepticism to something considerably harder. "Mr. Beaumont," the judge said, "I am inclined to dismiss this water rights complaint as without merit pending a fuller review of the evidence presented today regarding a pattern of conduct that frankly troubles me a great deal more than any question of aquifer flow. I am also inclined to refer these matters to the county prosecutor for formal investigation, given the seriousness of the allegations and the corroborating testimony offered by multiple independent parties." Beaumont shot to his feet, his careful composure finally cracking wide open. "This is outrageous. I built half this county with my own 2 hands, while the rest of you were too busy failing at ranching to notice opportunity when it stood in front of you." "You didn't build it," came a voice from the gallery, and Abigail turned to see the Ellison daughter, standing her face white, but her voice steady. "You burned it down, and called the ashes an opportunity." The gallery erupted, voices rising all at once, years of quiet suspicion finally given room to speak, and Judge Hargrove had to bang his gavel twice before order returned. But by then something had already shifted in that courtroom that no amount of gavel banging could undo. Cyrus Beaumont, for the first time in 20 years, was no longer the man everyone in Clearwater Crossing quietly feared and openly deferred to. He was in the space of a single afternoon, a man cornered by his own history, standing alone at the front of a room full of people who had finally stopped pretending they hadn't noticed. He did not stay to hear the rest of it. He pushed past his lawyer, past the gallery, out the courthouse doors, with his jaw set and his eyes hard, and Abigail felt Jacob's hand find hers under the table, gripping tight, both of them watching him go with the particular wariness of people who understood that a man that thoroughly humiliated rarely simply walked away and let the matter rest. They were right to be wary. It was 2 nights later, with the trench finally finished, and the first cuttings of hay already stacked golden and fragrant in the mended barn, that Ezra came pounding on the cabin door well past midnight, his face white in the lamplight, breathless from a dead run across the yard. "Riders," he gasped. "Coming up the road fast. 6 or 7 of them, and Miss Harper, I think one of them's Beaumont himself." Jacob was already reaching for his rifle, already moving toward the door with a grim, focused calm that Abigail had come to recognize as the shape his fear took when there wasn't time to feel it properly. "Get Silas and Ezra's cousins into the root cellar," he said. "Abigail, I'm not hiding," she said, already reaching for the second rifle they kept by the door, the one Jacob had insisted on the night the barn nearly burned. "I've fought a fire on this land, Jacob Calloway, and a fraud, and a courtroom full of his lawyer's threats. I'm not about to hide in a cellar the one night it might actually matter that I don't." He looked at her a long moment, fear and fierce, unwilling pride warring plain across his face, and then he nodded once, because he had learned by now that there was no version of Abigail Harper that stood quietly aside while her home was under threat. The riders came up, hard dust boiling behind them in the moonlight, and Cyrus Beaumont reined in at the edge of the yard with his men fanned out behind him, and Abigail understood, looking at his face, that whatever composure had cracked in that courtroom had not mended since, had instead curdled into something desperate and reckless. "Calloway." Beaumont called, his voice rougher than Abigail had ever heard it, stripped of its usual oily confidence. "You and that woman have cost me everything I built. County prosecutors talking indictment. Banks pulling every note I ever touched. 20 years, and you two undo it in a single summer." "You undid it yourself, Cyrus," Jacob said, standing his ground at the top of the porch steps, rifle held loose but ready. "Every fire you set, every fence you cut, every man you paid to hurt somebody who trusted you, that's yours, not ours. I offered you a fair price for this land," Beaumont said, his voice climbing unsteady. "I offered you a way out before it ever came to this. You could have taken the money and started fresh somewhere. The bank ledgers and county records don't know your name. Instead, you let her—" He jabbed a finger toward Abigail, and she felt Jacob go rigid beside her. "Turn this into a crusade. You could have had a quiet life. She wouldn't let you." "She gave me a life worth having," Jacob said, low and fierce. "That's more than you ever offered anybody, Cyrus." You offered ruin dressed up as rescue 4 times over, and we're the first ranch in 15 years that didn't fall for it." Beaumont's hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip, and Abigail felt her own pulse spike hard and fast. But before he could draw it, before anything in that tense standoff could tip into violence, the sound of more riders reached them from down the road, a full dozen at least, torches lit against the dark, and at the front of them, unmistakable, even at a distance, Sheriff Dunmore flanked by Doc Sherman and Halloran, and riding stiff but determined, despite her age, Mrs. Petrie herself. "Word travels fast in a small valley." "Cyrus," Dunmore called out, reining in his horse between Beaumont's men and the Calloway porch. "Especially when half the folks you've wronged over the years finally start talking to each other, instead of keeping their grief private and separate. Ellison girl came to me an hour ago, said she'd heard from a hand at your place that you were riding out here tonight with blood in your eye. Seemed like something the law ought to know about." Beaumont's face, lit orange by torchlight, had gone from fury to something closer to panic. The particular panic of a man realizing the walls he'd spent 20 years building around his own reputation had finally completely come down. "I've got nothing left to lose," he said, and there was something raw and dangerous in the words a man speaking past the edge of his own careful control. "You've got your life," Dunmore said, quiet now, steady. "Which is more than you offered Silas Petrie the night your man put a bullet in him. Don't make tonight the night you lose that too, Cyrus. Put the gun down. Let the court sort out what's owed. That's the only path left that don't end worse for you than the one you're standing on right now." Beaumont's eyes flicked from Dunmore to the ring of torchlit faces surrounding him, and something desperate moved behind them. A man doing arithmetic he did not like the answer to. "You don't understand what it cost me," he said, his voice cracking now, all pretense of composure finally gone. "My father left me nothing but debt, and a name nobody respected. I built this from scratch, clawed every acre of it out of men too weak to hold what they had." "You didn't build anything," Halloran said, his old voice carrying clear and hard across the yard. "I surveyed every one of those acres myself, Cyrus. I watched you take what other men bled for, and call the taking a triumph. There's no scratch in that. Just theft with better boots than most." "Careful," Beaumont snapped. But the word had no weight left in it, no threat behind it that anyone in that yard still feared. "I've been careful for 20 years, Halloran said. "Watching you do this to good families and telling myself it wasn't my business to say so. I'm done being careful, Cyrus. Reckon most of this valley is." Beaumont's shoulders dropped another fraction, and Abigail watched something in him finally break loose from whatever had held it rigid for 2 decades. Not remorse, she thought, not exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent so long maintaining a lie that the lie has become heavier to carry than the truth ever would have been. The silence that followed stretched long and taut, every person in that yard holding their breath together, torchlight flickering across faces that had for 2 decades been too frightened, or too complicit, or too tired to stand against the man now sitting alone atop his horse, with his hand hovering near a pistol he hadn't yet drawn. It was Abigail who broke it, stepping forward past Jacob before he could stop her, her voice carrying clear and unshaking across the yard. "You said I turned this into a crusade, Mr. Beaumont. Maybe I did. But look around you." She gestured slow and deliberate at the ring of torchlit faces surrounding him. Dunmore and Doc Sherman Halloran, with his bitter 20-year grudge, finally vindicated Mrs. Petrie, sitting straight-backed on her horse, despite her years Ezra and his cousins peering out from the cabin doorway where they'd refused in the end to hide. "This isn't my crusade anymore. It's theirs. Every family you ever ruined finally found their voice this summer, and it wasn't because of anything I did alone. It's because enough of us stopped being afraid at the same time. You can't threaten that away, Cyrus. It's already happened." Beaumont looked at her a long moment, something breaking behind his eyes, and then slowly, his hand fell away from the pistol at his hip, and his shoulders sagged with the particular collapse of a man who has finally run out of road. "Get down off that horse," Dunmore said, quiet but firm, and this time Beaumont obeyed, dismounting stiff and silent, his men behind him, already backing their horses away, unwilling to share whatever fate their employer had finally ridden himself into. Dunmore took him into custody there in the Callaway yard, under torchlight, in front of the very neighbors he'd spent 20 years quietly terrorizing, and as they led him away toward town, toward a formal charge and a trial that would in the weeks to come unravel 15 years of fraud and violence, one careful piece of evidence at a time, Abigail felt the tension that had lived, coiled tight in her chest, since the day she'd stepped off that stagecoach, finally gradually begin to loosen. Jacob's arm came around her in the sudden quiet that followed, and she leaned into him, without hesitation, watching the torches recede down the road, the whole valley's held breath finally cautiously beginning to release. "It's over," Jacob said, though his voice held more disbelief than certainty, like a man still waiting for the ground to prove it was really solid beneath him. "The worst of it," Abigail said. "There's still a trial, still work to finish, still a harvest to bring in, and a winter to survive." She looked up at him, and found in the torchlight, still flickering across his face, something she'd never quite let herself believe she'd find in any man's eyes. Least of all, a man who'd once written to a mail-order agency asking for nothing more than someone to sweep his floors. "But the worst of it is over, Jacob. He can't burn us out from under ourselves anymore. Nobody can." Mrs. Petrie rode up beside them. Then her weathered face creased with something between exhaustion and fierce satisfaction, and reached down to press Abigail's hand between both of hers. "You did what nobody in this valley had the courage to do in 20 years, dear," she said. "You looked a monster in the eye and refused to look away first." "I had help," Abigail said, glancing around at the yard full of neighbors who 3 months earlier had laughed at her from the boardwalk of Clearwater Crossing, and now sat their horses in her yard at midnight, having ridden to defend her home as though it were their own. "I had a great deal of help. You had help because you gave people a reason to believe help was worth offering," Mrs. Petrie said. "That's rarer than you know, Miss Harper. Don't ever let anybody make you small enough to forget it." The riders dispersed slowly after that, back toward their own homes, under a sky just beginning to gray at its eastern edge, and Abigail stood in the yard a long while after the last of them had gone, watching dawn creep up over pasture that had been fought for with fire and blood and stubborn, unrelenting hope, and felt for the first time since a stagecoach wheel had thrown her hard against a door, 11 days out from Kansas, entirely and completely certain that she had found the place she was meant to stand. Jacob found her there as the sun cleared the ridge, and did not speak right away, just stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, watching the same light spread gold across a trench that had finally been finished, a barn that had finally stopped burning, a ranch that had finally, after 4 years of slow collapse and one impossible summer, stopped being something a man was destined to lose. "My pa used to say the sunrise looked different depending on what a man had to lose that day," Jacob said quietly. "I never understood what he meant till just now." Abigail didn't answer right away, just watched the light climb higher, warm and steady and entirely unhurried, the way mornings were supposed to feel on land that finally truly belonged to the people willing to fight for it. Inside, she could hear Silas stirring Ezra's low voice, asking him if he needed water. The ordinary sounds of a household waking to a day that no longer carried the particular dread it had carried every morning since a stagecoach wheel first threw her against a door 11 days out from Kansas. She thought of the girl she'd been on her father's failing farm, told plainly she'd never be wanted, and found she could no longer quite recognize the shape of that old small fear worn down at last by a summer of fences mended and fires fought, and a valley's silence finally thoroughly broken. "Come inside," Jacob said softly, his hand finding hers. "Rest a while. We've earned it." "We have," Abigail agreed, and let him lead her back toward the cabin that had become somewhere in the long fight of that summer, without either of them quite marking the day it happened entirely and unmistakably home. The trial convened 3 weeks later in the same courthouse where Cyrus Beaumont had once stood confident in his fine gray suit, and this time he sat at the defendant's table, with his shoulders bowed and his Helena lawyer looking considerably less certain of victory than he had at the water rights hearing. Abigail testified for the better part of an hour, laying out the pattern she and Halloran had built from county records and grieving families, and when the county prosecutor finally called Silas to the stand, his arm still in a sling, his voice steady, despite the effort it plainly cost him. Abigail watched the last of the courtroom's doubt drain from 12 careful faces in the jury box. He said Beaumont wanted to know if I'd talked. Silas told them, and when I wouldn't answer him plain, he shot me and rode off toward the Beaumont spread like he had every right in the world to do it and walk away clean. The verdict came 2 days later. Guilty on charges of arson, conspiracy, and assault, with intent with the judge, noting for the record that the pattern of fraud, spanning 4 prior land acquisitions, would be referred separately to the State Attorney General's office for further prosecution. Cyrus Beaumont was sentenced to 20 years at the Territorial Prison 1 year. Halloran remarked afterward with grim satisfaction for every year he'd spent quietly robbing the valley blind. "It's done," Jacob said as they rode home from the courthouse that final afternoon, the words carrying a weight that seemed almost too large for such a small sentence to hold. "It's done," Abigail agreed, and let herself feel for the first time since a stagecoach wheel had thrown her hard against a door, months before the particular lightness of a fight finally completely won. The harvest came in that September, richer than anyone in the valley had predicted, the finished trench carrying water through pastures that had once gone brown and brittle by midsummer, and Jacob stood at the edge of the hayfield. One golden afternoon, watching wagon after wagon roll toward the barn, loaded higher than he'd ever managed alone, his face carrying an expression Abigail had never once seen on him before. Not relief, not even pride exactly, but something closer to wonder. The look of a man watching a dream he'd stopped believing in quietly come true around him. "My pa dreamed of a harvest like this," he said when she came to stand beside him. "Talked about it right up until the end, doubling the yield if that trench ever got finished. I used to think he was telling himself a story to make the dying easier." "Maybe he was," Abigail said gently. "Men do that. Tell themselves stories that make the leaving softer. Doesn't mean the story wasn't also true." Jacob was quiet a moment, watching the wagons roll steady toward the barn. "I want to show you something," he said finally, and led her not toward the fields, but toward a low rise behind the cabin, a modest stone marker, half swallowed by summer grass, that Abigail had passed a dozen times without ever asking about. "My pa," Jacob said simply, kneeling to clear the grass from the stone with careful hands, "and my ma beside him, and this," his hand moved to a smaller stone, weathered nearly smooth, "was my first wife, Sarah." Abigail said nothing, understanding that this was not a moment that wanted words, and knelt beside him in the grass while he cleared away 3 seasons of neglect. From graves he had clearly been too afraid to visit, often the particular fear of a man who did not trust himself to stand at a graveside and not fall apart entirely. "She died birthing a child that didn't live either," Jacob said, his voice rough. "Winter before last, I buried them both in the same week, and I told myself I was done, Abigail. Done with wanting a family, done with hoping for anything past keeping this ranch standing long enough to prove her dying meant something. That's the man who wrote that letter to the agency. Not a man looking for love. A man too broken to ask for it plain, so he asked for a housekeeper instead, and told himself that was enough." "It's not a small thing what you're telling me," Abigail said quietly. "No," Jacob agreed. "It ain't." He looked up at her, and there was nothing guarded left in his face, nothing held back the way it had been that first day on the stagecoach road. "I need you to know all of it, Abigail. Before I ask you what I mean to ask you, I need you to know I buried a wife and a child on this land, and that for a long while I believed I didn't deserve to want anything past surviving it." Abigail's throat tightened, and she reached for his hand where it rested on the weathered stone, holding it steady. "And now I want to marry you properly," Jacob said. "Not the arrangement we signed with the agency, not a business deal dressed up in vows because it was convenient for both of us. I want to stand up in front of this whole valley and marry you because I love you, Abigail Harper, because you walked into a life I'd already given up on and made me believe it was worth having again. I should have said this weeks ago. I was afraid I think that saying it plain might jinx whatever it was we'd built. But Beaumont's behind bars, and the harvest is in, and I don't want to wait one more day to say it true." Abigail felt tears rise hot and sudden. The particular tears of a woman who had spent a lifetime being told she was not the kind of woman men wrote love into their letters for, and found she could not immediately answer. Could only sit there in the summer grass beside 3 graves and one enormous unguarded confession. Feeling something crack open in her chest that had been locked tight since long before she'd ever heard the name Jacob Calloway. "I came here believing I'd be lucky to be tolerated," she said finally, her voice unsteady. "That's the plain truth of it, Jacob. I didn't come chasing love. I came chasing a purpose because my own family made it clear there wasn't a man alive who'd want more than that from a woman built the way I'm built. I didn't let myself hope for what you're offering me now. I didn't think I was allowed to." "You're allowed," Jacob said, fierce and certain. "You've always been allowed, Abigail. Anybody who told you otherwise was wrong, and I include myself in that. The day I first saw you step off that stagecoach and let disappointment show on my face before you'd said a single word to me. You've more than made up for that day," Abigail said, and found at last that she was smiling through the tears, a smile that felt entirely unfamiliar on her own face, wide and unguarded and disbelieving all at once. "Yes, Jacob Calloway, I'll marry you properly. I'll stand up in front of this whole valley and say it true same as you." He kissed her there among the graves, gentle and certain, and Abigail understood in that quiet moment that this was not a man asking her to replace what he'd lost, but a man finally fully ready to build something new alongside her, honoring what had come before, without being buried beneath it. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, not in the small church in Clearwater Crossing, but in the ranch yard itself, under a sky gone soft gold, with early autumn light, and the whole valley came. Mrs. Petrie in her Sunday best halloran, grinning wide enough to show the gap where his tooth had been. Doc Sherman and Sheriff Dunmore standing together near the barn. Silas with his arm finally free of its sling. Ezra beaming like the day belonged partly to him too. The Ellison daughter and the Carmichael widow, both present, both smiling, in a way Abigail suspected they hadn't smiled freely in years. Even Otis Whitfield came hat in hand, standing near the back like a man uncertain of his welcome, and Abigail made a point of crossing the yard to greet him personally before the ceremony began. "Didn't expect you'd want me here, Miss Harper." He admitted shame plain on his face. "After everything." "You corrected your account when I asked," Abigail said. "And you never once threw in with Beaumont against us when it would have been easy money to do so. I don't hold grudges against men willing to be better than their first mistake, Mr. Whitfield. Not on my wedding day, and not any other day either." He shifted his hat between his hands, clearly unused to being spoken to with such plain generosity. "Most folks in my position wouldn't have been half so forgiving, Mrs. Calloway. I cheated a struggling rancher and only fixed it because you caught me at it." "Most folks confuse forgiveness with forgetting," Abigail said. "I haven't forgotten a thing, Mr. Whitfield. I've simply decided that holding a grudge against a man actively trying to do better serves nobody, least of all me." He left the ceremony that afternoon looking like a man who'd been given something he hadn't expected to deserve. And Abigail thought, watching him go, that perhaps this was the truest measure of everything they'd built that summer. Not just a ranch saved, not just a land baron brought low, but a whole valley slowly, stubbornly relearning how to trust each other again. There was one more face in that crowd Abigail had not expected and did not fully understand her own feelings about, until the older woman approached her directly near the edge of the yard, the same woman who'd stood outside the mercantile the day Abigail arrived and muttered loud enough to be heard that poor Jacob Calloway was fixing to bury himself under her. "Mrs. Foster," Abigail said, carefully recognizing her at last. "I owe you an apology, Miss Harper," the woman said, twisting her gloved hands together, unable quite to meet Abigail's eyes. "What I said that first day. It was cruel, and it was thoughtless, and I've had a whole summer to watch you prove me about as wrong as a woman's ever been proven. I'm sorry for it, truly." Abigail considered her a long moment, feeling the old sting of that first cruel afternoon rise up briefly before settling unexpectedly into something closer to grace than anger. "I appreciate you saying so, Mrs. Foster. Took a fair amount of courage, I expect, walking over here to say it plain instead of just thinking it quiet and letting it be." "I've thought a great many unkind things in my life," Mrs. Foster admitted. "Not often had the nerve to unthink them out loud. Then today's as good a day as any to start." Abigail said, and found she meant it without a trace of bitterness, because she understood standing there in her wedding dress, with a valley full of once doubtful neighbors gathered to celebrate her, that holding on to every old cruelty would have cost her more than the cruelty itself ever had. The ceremony itself was simple, no more than a circuit preacher's careful words, and two people standing before a community that had watched them fight for everything they now shared. But when Jacob slid a plain gold band onto Abigail's finger and looked at her like she was the answer to a prayer, he'd stopped believing God was listening to. Abigail felt the whole weight of that summer's fear and fire and fury settle finally into something steady and permanent and entirely her own. "Mrs. Calloway," Jacob said, testing the name on her at last, and Abigail laughed bright and unguarded, because for the first time in her life, being called somebody's wife did not feel like a consolation prize handed to a woman nobody else wanted. It felt like exactly what it was, a fact plainly true, spoken by a man who had chosen her with his whole, clear-eyed heart. The prosperity that followed that autumn changed the shape of the Calloway Ranch entirely, but it did not change Abigail, not the parts of her that mattered, and she made certain of that from the very first week of their marriage. She refused Jacob's suggestion that she hire help for the cooking and washing, now that they could afford it, insisting instead that any extra income go first toward fair wages for Ezra and Silas, and the Petrie cousins, who'd stayed on through harvest, and toward building something the valley had never had before, a small schoolhouse, modest but solid, built on Calloway land, and open to any child in the valley whose family couldn't otherwise afford proper schooling. "You don't have to build a school, Abigail," Jacob said, half amused, half in awe, watching her sketch out plans for the building at the kitchen table one evening. "We could just as easy send money to the church fund and call it charity enough. I spent my girlhood watching my own schooling get sacrificed first whenever money ran short," Abigail said, not looking up from her sketch. "My brothers stayed in school. I got pulled to work the farm the day I turned 12 because a daughter's education was considered a luxury a struggling family couldn't afford. I don't aim to let that happen to another girl in this valley if I've got the means to prevent it." Jacob was quiet a moment, watching her work, something soft and fierce moving behind his eyes. "You never told me that." "There's a great deal I haven't told you yet," Abigail said. "We've got the rest of our lives for the telling." The school went up before the first snow, and Abigail personally recruited a young widow from town, a woman named Constance, who'd lost her husband to influenza the previous winter, and had been struggling to support 2 children alone to teach in it, offering her a fair wage and a small cottage on Calloway land in exchange. "You don't know me from Eve, Mrs. Calloway," Constance said, disbelieving the first day Abigail made the offer. "Why would you trust me with such a thing?" "Because I know what it is to be a woman the world's decided has nothing left to offer," Abigail said. "And I know that's rarely true. You taught school in Ohio before you married Mrs. Petrie tells me. That knowledge didn't disappear just because your circumstances changed. Seems a waste to let it sit unused while children in this valley go without proper letters." Constance wept at that quietly and took the position, and by the time the first snow fell that November, the little schoolhouse held 11 children from 4 different ranches, their laughter carrying across the yard in a way that made Abigail's chest ache with a satisfaction she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. It was that same autumn that a letter arrived from Kansas. Her mother's careful, cramped handwriting on the envelope, the first correspondence Abigail had received from her family since the day she'd boarded the stagecoach west. She sat with it unopened at the kitchen table for the better part of an hour before she found the nerve to break the seal. Half expecting more of the old disappointment, the tired assurances that she'd best not expect too much from a marriage built on desperation. Instead, she found 4 pages describing how word of the Calloway Ranch's triumph over a corrupt land baron had reached. Even Kansas carried in a newspaper account a cousin had clipped and mailed home, and how her mother had read it 3 times through with tears she hadn't expected and couldn't fully explain, and how she was sorry, so sorry for every unkind word ever spoken about what kind of life a daughter built the way Abigail was built might expect to find. "I was wrong about you." Her mother had written the ink pressed hard enough into the page that Abigail could feel the shape of the words beneath her fingers. "I hope it isn't too late to say so." Abigail read the letter twice, then a third time, and found herself weeping at the kitchen table in a way she hadn't allowed herself to weep since long before the stagecoach ever carried her west. Not from old hurt, but from something closer to release. A door she hadn't realized she was still holding shut, finally allowed to swing open. "Good news?" Jacob asked gently, finding her there. "My mother finally believes I'm worth something," Abigail said, wiping her eyes, laughing a little through the tears. "Took a newspaper article and a whole territory's worth of proof, but she got there eventually. Some folks need the whole world to agree before they trust their own eyes," Jacob said, sitting beside her, taking her hand. "Don't make her believing any less real. Just means it cost more to get there than it should have." Abigail wrote back that same evening a long letter of her own, careful and generous forgiving, without pretending the old wounds had never existed, and sealed it with a lightness in her chest she hadn't expected a single piece of mail from Kansas could ever bring her. Silas stayed on through the winter as well. His shoulder healed enough by December to work full days again, and he came to Abigail one evening near Christmas with an envelope in his hand and an expression she'd come to recognize as the particular mix of gratitude and shame that had marked him since the night he'd confessed his part in Beaumont's scheme. "Sent this off to my ma's doctor last week," he said, holding out the envelope, which Abigail realized held a receipt, not a request. "Paid off the last of her bills. Wanted you to know your wages made that possible, Miss Harper. Mrs. Calloway, I mean. Beg pardon, still getting used to it." "You don't owe me an accounting, Silas," Abigail said, though she felt her throat tighten regardless. "You've more than made up for that mistake working this ranch honest all summer and fall, standing up in that courtroom when it would have been easier to stay quiet." "I owe you plenty," Silas said. "You could have had me arrested, could have run me off in shame. Instead, you gave me a chance to be something better than the worst thing I ever did. I don't forget things like that, ma'am. Don't intend to." Abigail thought of that conversation often through the winter that followed. Turning it over, the way she turned over every important thing that happened to her, and found in it something like the shape of everything the ranch had become. Not a place built on punishment or grudges, but on the stubborn, difficult work of second chances offered plainly and without condition to anyone willing to earn them honestly. Not every change came easy. There were nights that first winter when Jacob woke from dreams Abigail suspected were about the wife and child he'd buried on that low rise behind the cabin, and she learned slowly the particular patience required to sit with a man's grief without trying to talk him out of it, to simply be present in the dark until his breathing steadied again. "You don't have to pretend it doesn't still hurt," she told him once after one such night, her hand steady on his chest in the dark. "Loving me doesn't mean you have to stop grieving them." "I know," Jacob said quietly. "I think that's part of why I love you the way I do, Abigail. You never once asked me to choose between missing them and wanting you. Most folks would have. Most folks haven't spent a lifetime understanding what it costs to be asked to shrink yourself down for somebody else's comfort," Abigail said. "I'd never do that to you. Grief's not a debt you owe me silence about." He pulled her closer in the dark, and Abigail lay there a long while listening to his breathing, even out into real sleep, thinking of the ledgers she'd first read at that kitchen table months before. Thinking of fences mended and fires fought and a trench finished that a dead man had started and never believed his son would live to complete, and understood with a clarity that felt like the truest thing she'd ever known. That this was what a marriage built on more than convenience actually looked like. Not the absence of pain, but two people willing to carry each other's pain without flinching from the weight of it. The hardest test of that first winter came in late January, when a blizzard rolled down out of the mountains with almost no warning, burying the valley under snow, deep enough to swallow fence posts whole, and driving temperatures low enough that Jacob spoke of it afterward, the way other men spoke of the fire that had nearly taken their barn, as a thing that could have ended everything had it gone even slightly different. "Cattle are scattered toward the North Ridge," Jacob said, shouting to be heard over wind that seemed determined to tear the words right out of his mouth. "If we don't get them moved to shelter before dark, we'll lose half the herd by morning." "Then we'd best not lose daylight arguing about it," Abigail said, already wrapping herself in every layer of wool she owned, and together with Silas and Ezra, they rode out into a whiteness so complete that Abigail lost sight of Jacob's horse more than once, despite him riding no more than 10 feet ahead of her. snow driving sideways hard enough to sting exposed skin like needles. They found the cattle huddled miserable and half-frozen against a stand of pine, and it took the better part of 3 brutal hours to drive them back toward the barn. Abigail's hands gone numb inside her gloves, her lungs burning with cold air that felt like breathing knives. But she did not once suggest turning back because she had learned over one impossible summer that a herd left to die in a storm was every bit as much a threat to the ranch's future as any fire Cyrus Beaumont had ever set. They lost only 4 head that night, a number Doc Sherman told them afterward was closer to a miracle than a misfortune. And when Abigail finally collapsed into a chair before the kitchen stove wrapped in every blanket the cabin owned, shivering so hard her teeth chattered, Jacob knelt before her and took her frozen hands between his own, working feeling slowly back into her fingers with a tenderness that made her throat tighten all over again. "You could have stayed inside tonight," he said, though there was no real reproach in it, only the particular exhausted gratitude of a man who had watched his wife ride into a blizzard without hesitation. "We've had this conversation before, Jacob Calloway," Abigail said, her voice hoarse from cold and wind both. "I believe my answer's the same as it was the night of the fire. I don't know how to stand back and watch. It isn't in me, and I don't expect marriage vows to have changed that particular flaw." "It ain't a flaw," Jacob said quietly, pressing a kiss to her numb knuckles. "It's the truest thing about you and I. Thank God every day that you walked off that stagecoach carrying it." Spring came slow that year, the way it always did in Montana, but when it finally arrived, it arrived generous. The ranch's second season already showing signs of outpacing even the astonishing harvest before it. Word of the Calloway Ranch's transformation had spread well beyond Clearwater Crossing by then, carried by traveling salesmen and circuit preachers, and the occasional curious rancher from 3 counties over. All of them wanting to see for themselves the spread that had toppled Cyrus Beaumont's 15-year scheme and turned failing land into the valley's finest grazing in the space of a single remarkable year. "You've made us famous," Jacob said one evening, only half joking, as they read through yet another letter from a rancher 2 counties east asking Abigail's advice on irrigation. "I've made us honest," Abigail corrected, though she couldn't fully suppress her own quiet pride. "Fame's just what happens when honesty finally gets noticed after being ignored long enough." She answered every letter herself, patient and thorough, sharing what she'd learned about grazing rotation and water management, and fair bookkeeping with any rancher willing to ask, because she remembered too well what it felt like to watch good work get buried by neglect and bad luck, and men too proud or too frightened to ask for help, and she had no intention of letting that particular kind of silence take root in this valley ever again. By the time the second summer's wildflowers bloomed thick across the pastures, she'd once walked with a notebook and a stranger's cold suspicion trailing behind her. Abigail Harper. Calloway stood at the center of a community that had learned slowly, and sometimes painfully, that the woman they'd once laughed off a stagecoach was the very reason so many of their own fortunes had finally begun to turn. She did not think of herself as remarkable. She thought of herself, when she thought of it at all, as a woman who had simply refused to accept the smallness other people had tried to hand her, and had found in that refusal not just a ranch worth saving, but an entire life worth having built, plank by plank and season by season, out of stubborn work and unflinching honesty, and a love that had grown slow and certain out of the very ashes everyone had once expected to bury her beneath. She thought too of the girl on that first stagecoach ride, chin high and jaw set against a street full of strangers who'd already decided what she was worth before she'd said a single word, and found she could look back at that girl now, not with pity, but with something close to fierce protective pride. The particular pride of a woman who had never once, not through fire nor fraud, nor a bullet meant to silence the truth, allowed anyone else's small opinion of her to become the whole of her own story. 10 years passed, the way hard-won years always do, quickly in memory, and slowly in the living of them, and by the time the Calloway Ranch marked its first decade under Abigail's steady hand, it had become the finest spread in 3 counties, its name spoken in the same breath as prosperity itself, wherever cattlemen gathered to talk business. The trench Jacob's father had started, and never lived to finish now, fed irrigation channels running the length of 4 pastures. Channels Abigail had designed herself, After years of careful study, and the herd that had once numbered barely 200, head-thin and drought-starved, now numbered close to 2,000 fat and glossy, shipped by rail to markets as far as Chicago. Another letter from Wyoming. Jacob said one autumn morning, setting the mail down on the kitchen table, where Abigail sat with a ledger open before her, the same careful hand still tracking every dollar in and out, though the numbers themselves had grown almost unrecognizable from the desperate arithmetic of that first summer. Young rancher asking if you'd consider coming out to advise on a water rights dispute. Says he heard what you did to Cyrus Beaumont, and figures if anybody can help him stand up to the cattle company squeezing his family off their land, it's you. Abigail smiled, setting down her pen. Add him to the list. I'll write back this week. You know you've built something of a reputation, Jacob said, settling into the chair across from her, the same chair he'd sat in that very first night staring at a ledger he couldn't make sense of, wondering what kind of woman he'd actually married. Half the ranchers in this territory know your name now. Not mine. Yours. Our name, Abigail corrected gently. I never once did any of it without you standing beside me, Jacob Calloway, and I'll thank you to remember that before you start feeling sorry for yourself over who gets mentioned first in a newspaper article. He laughed the easy, unguarded laugh of a man who had long since stopped carrying the weight he'd carried that first summer and reached across the table to take her hand. Calloused now, in all the same places hers, were both of them, marked by a decade of shared stubborn labor. Their children found them there a moment later, tumbling into the kitchen with the particular chaos of a household that had never once known the quiet, careful sorrow that had lived in that cabin before Abigail arrived. Twin boys, 8 years old, arguing loudly over whose turn it was to feed the chickens. And behind them, a girl of 6, with her mother's steady gaze and her father's stubborn chin, already declaring that she intended to run the ranch herself one day, and didn't see why her brother should get any say in the matter. She gets that from you, Jacob said, watching his daughter march past with the particular fierce certainty Abigail recognized from her own reflection. She gets it from both of us, Abigail said. Same as everything else worth having on this land. It was later that same week, with the first frost silvering the pasture grass, that a visitor arrived unannounced. A young reporter from a Helena newspaper, notebook in hand, asking to speak with the Callaways about the ranch's remarkable transformation for a story his editor wanted on prosperous women of the territory. Folks back in the capital have heard the name Callaway more than once, the young man said, seated awkwardly at the kitchen table with his pencil poised. I understand you're the one who brought down Cyrus Beaumont's whole operation. Uncovered fraud going back 15 years, testified against him yourself in open court. I had a great deal of help. Abigail said the same answer she'd given Mrs. Petrie a decade before, still true now as it had been then. Neighbors who'd been wronged just as badly, a surveyor with a long memory, and a longer grudge, a sheriff willing to finally do his job properly once the evidence was undeniable. I didn't do any of it alone. But you're the one who started it, the reporter pressed. The one who noticed the pattern nobody else had caught in 15 years. Abigail considered that a moment, glancing at Jacob, who watched her with the same quiet pride he'd worn every day since the courthouse verdict a decade before. I noticed it because I was looking for it, she said finally. I'd spent my whole life being told I wasn't worth much, Mr. Reeves. When you've spent that long being underestimated, you get very good at noticing when other people are being cheated the same way. It gives you a particular kind of eye for it. The reporter scribbled that down eagerly, then glanced toward Jacob. And you, Mr. Calloway? What was it like watching your wife take down one of the most powerful men in the territory? Jacob was quiet a moment, and Abigail recognized the particular stillness that meant he was choosing his words with care, the way he'd learned to do over a decade of marriage to a woman who valued honest words above pretty ones. I wrote to a mail-order agency 10 years ago asking for a housekeeper, Jacob said finally. Somebody to sweep my floors and not complain about the loneliness. I didn't believe I deserved anything more than that. I'd buried a wife and a child, and I'd about buried my own hope right along with them. He reached across the table, took Abigail's hand in his, and something in his voice thickened with an emotion he made no effort to hide. I asked for someone to sweep my cabin, God sent me the woman who taught me how to build a future instead. Everything this ranch is today, every acre, every dollar, every child laughing in that yard, that's hers as much as mine. More if I'm honest about it." The reporter's pencil had gone still on the page, and Abigail felt her own throat tighten at hearing plain in public the same sentiment Jacob had whispered to her privately more times than she could count over the years, but never quite framed so completely for a stranger's notebook. "That'll make quite a story," the young man said finally, his voice a little unsteady. "It's not a story," Abigail said. "It's just what happened. Sometimes the truth reads that way, if you let it." He left an hour later with pages of notes, and Abigail suspected from the look on his face considerably more than he'd come expecting to find, and the article that ran in the Helena paper 2 weeks after carried the headline, "The Woman Who Toppled a Land Baron and Built a Kingdom in His Ashes." Word of it traveled far enough that letters began arriving not just from struggling ranchers, but from young women too. Girls in towns Abigail had never visited writing to ask how a woman built the way she was built had found the courage to believe herself worth fighting for. She answered every one of them personally, patient and honest, never once pretending the fight had been easy or the doubt had ever fully disappeared. Only that she had learned over one impossible summer and the decade that followed it that other people's small opinions were never obligated to become the whole of her own story. One such letter arrived not by post, but in person the following spring, when a young woman named Delphine appeared at the ranch gate on foot, having walked the last 3 miles from town after her wagon axle broke her dress travel-stained and her eyes red from crying long before she ever knocked at the cabin door. "They said you might help," Delphine said, once Abigail had settled her at the kitchen table, with strong tea and a plate of bread she barely touched. "My husband's brother is trying to force us off our claim. Says our filing was improper, says the land's rightfully his on some technicality nobody can explain plain to me. I don't understand half the papers he's shown us, and my husband's afraid to fight it, afraid we'll lose everything trying." Abigail felt something old and familiar stir in her chest, the particular fire that had once carried her through a summer of fences and fraud and fire, and reached across the table to take the younger woman's trembling hand. "Fear's a natural thing to feel when somebody with more money than conscience comes after what's yours," Abigail said. "But fear's never once been a reason to stop fighting, Delphine. It's only ever been the reason people give themselves for giving up too soon. Bring me every paper you've got, every filing, every letter, every document his lawyers waved in front of you. I've read enough fraudulent land claims in my time to know exactly what to look for." They spent the better part of a week at that kitchen table, the same table where Abigail had once untangled Jacob's ledgers by lamplight, and by the end of it, Abigail had found what she'd expected to find, a filing error on the brother-in-law's side. Not Delphine's buried deep enough in county paperwork that only someone who'd learned to read such documents the hard way would ever have caught it. "You saved our home," Delphine said, weeping openly, now gratitude replacing the fear that had carried her those 3 miles on foot. "You saved your own home," Abigail corrected gently. "I only showed you where to look. That's a distinction worth remembering, Delphine, long after I'm not around to remind you of it. Anybody can hand somebody an answer. The lasting gift is teaching them to find their own." Delphine's case was not the last. Word spread through the territory the way word always did, carried farmer to farmer, church pew to church pew, until Abigail found herself more often than not sitting across her own kitchen table from some new stranger, clutching a folder of confusing papers, and a desperate hope that the woman who'd toppled Cyrus Beaumont might do the same for whatever smaller injustice had landed on their own doorstep. "You can't save every struggling family in the territory," Jacob told her once, only half teasing, watching her prepare yet another pot of coffee for yet another anxious visitor. "No," Abigail agreed, "but I can save the ones who find their way to my door, and I intend to keep that door open for as long as I'm able. Seems the least I owe a valley that finally learned to stop laughing at me long enough to listen." Jacob only shook his head, smiling, and refilled the coffee pot without further argument, because he had learned over a decade of marriage that trying to talk Abigail Harper Calloway out of a fight she believed in was a considerably harder task than simply standing beside her while she won it. The valley itself had changed too slowly in ways that mattered more than the ranch's prosperity alone. The schoolhouse Abigail built that first autumn had grown to serve nearly 30 children. Now, with Constance still teaching her own 2 children grown alongside the valley's, and 3 other struggling families had taken up Abigail's offer of fair wages and honest work on Callaway land, when their own ventures had faltered, building small homes of their own. On ground Jacob's father would scarcely have recognized as the same failing ranch he'd left behind. Halloran, well into his 70s, now still came by twice a month to sit on the porch and complain cheerfully about the state of the county's record-keeping, having never quite let go of the particular satisfaction he'd found the day Abigail first asked for his help. "County recorder still can't keep a proper filing system," he grumbled one afternoon, settling into his usual chair with the ease of a man who'd long since become family in all but blood. "Reckon I'll have to come back and show them how it's done, seeing as nobody else in this territory seems to understand the value of a well-organized ledger." "You're the only man I know who finds joy in dusty paperwork, Mr. Halloran," Abigail said, setting a cup of coffee before him. "Dusty paperwork brought down Cyrus Beaumont," Halloran said, not without pride. "I'd say that's earned it a little joy." Silas, too, had stayed on all these years, no longer the frightened boy who'd once taken a stranger's money out of desperation, but a foreman now trusted with more responsibility than Abigail could have imagined offering him the night she'd sat across from him and chosen mercy over punishment. He'd married one of Mrs. Petrie's granddaughters 2 summers back, and brought his mother out from Ohio to live in a cottage of her own on Callaway land, her medical bills long since a memory rather than a burden. "Never thought I'd end up here," Silas told Abigail once, watching his own young son toddle across the yard toward the schoolhouse Constance was just then opening for the morning. "Not after what I did that first summer. Figured I'd ruined any chance at a decent life the moment I took that money." "You didn't ruin anything," Abigail said. "You made a mistake, and then you did the harder thing, which was to tell the truth about it and spend a decade proving you meant to be better. That's not ruin, Silas. That's about the finest kind of redemption a person can manage." Cyrus Beaumont himself was rarely spoken of anymore, his name having faded from a thing people whispered in fear to little more than a cautionary tale told to newcomers, curious about the valley's history. A man who had died in the territorial prison 6 years into his sentence. Alone, his once vast holdings broken up and sold back piece by piece to the very families he'd spent 20 years trying to ruin. Abigail felt when she thought of him at all, not triumph exactly, but a quiet, settled sense that the valley had righted something that had been badly wrong for far too long, and that the righting of it had cost exactly what it should have cost. Hard work, honest testimony, and a community finally brave enough to stop looking away. It was on the 10th anniversary of her arrival in Clearwater Crossing, a bright golden afternoon in late summer, with the whole valley gathered for what had become an annual harvest celebration on Callaway land, that Jacob found Abigail standing near the low rise behind the cabin, where 3 graves had long since been joined by careful new plantings of wildflowers she tended herself every spring. "You still come out here," Jacob said, coming to stand beside her. "I like to think your father would have approved of what we built from his unfinished trench," Abigail said. "And I like your first wife to know her memory was never something I meant to erase. This ranch has room enough for all our history, Jacob. The parts that hurt and the parts that healed both." Jacob was quiet a long moment, watching the children. Their 3 and a dozen more, belonging to neighbors, chase each other through the golden grass below, laughter carrying bright and unafraid across land that had once seemed destined for nothing but slow, quiet ruin. 10 years ago, I stood in this yard and watched a stagecoach pull away thinking I'd made the worst decision of my life, letting my disappointment show on my face before you'd even said a word to me, Jacob said. "I want you to know, I've thought about that moment near every day since Abigail. Not with shame anymore, with gratitude. Because you didn't let that moment be the whole story. You made me understand that a man's first reaction to something ain't nearly as important as what he does with the chance to be better afterward." Abigail leaned into him, watching the light spread gold and steady across pastures that had been fought for with fire and blood and a decade of unrelenting hope and felt standing there the particular fullness of a life built exactly the way she'd once dared not hope it could be. "I asked for someone to sweep my cabin," Jacob said again, softer now, the same words he'd offered that reporter weeks before, but spoken now only for her. "God sent me the woman who taught me how to build a future." "You built it too," Abigail said. "Don't ever let anybody, including yourself, tell that story wrong." Down in the yard, their daughter's voice rang out clear and certain above the general noise of the celebration, declaring to anyone who'd listen that she meant to grow up and run the finest ranch in the whole territory, better even than her mother's. And Abigail laughed bright and unguarded, watching a new generation already stepping forward to claim ground that had once seemed destined only for failure. She thought in that golden, unhurried moment of the girl who had once stepped off a stagecoach into a street full of strangers who'd already decided her worth before she'd spoken a single word, mocked and dismissed, and told plainly that no man would ever want more from her than desperate silent labor. That girl had not vanished. She had simply stubbornly proven every one of them wrong. One fence mended and one fire fought and one impossible harvest at a time, until the whole valley had no choice left but to watch her build from ashes and doubt and other people's cruelty. The richest, most enduring legacy any of them had ever seen. Never again would anyone in that valley mistake a woman's worth for the shape of her body or the smallness other people tried to force upon her. Abigail Harper Calloway had proven beyond any doubt this world could offer that true strength was never about how a person looked stepping off a stagecoach. It was about what they built afterward with nothing but their own two hands, their unbroken will and a heart too stubborn to ever believe it deserved less than everything.